Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity drifts as softly as snowfall and science unfolds at the speed of wonder. Tonight, we're heading north, far north, to a place so still, so quiet and so relentlessly cold that most of the world thinks of it as empty. But the Arctic, despite its icy armour, is anything but lifeless. It breathes, it shifts, it hides stories beneath its frozen skin. This is where life persists in ways that seem impossible. So, before we dive beneath the ice, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're somewhere warm, wrapped in a blanket. Maybe the hum of the city outside your window feels a world away from the whisper of snow. Wherever you are, take a moment to imagine the sound of nothing but wind and the faint creak of shifting ice. That's where our journey begins. And if you find this quiet expedition soothing, or perhaps a nice way to let the day melt away, a like or a subscribe helps this small corner of calm reach others who might also need a slow moment of awe. Now let's begin. Because beneath the frozen silence lies one of the most astonishing stories of survival on Earth. When people picture the Arctic, they usually imagine a flat white desert stretching endlessly to the horizon. A place where nothing grows, nothing moves, and nothing lives for long. The air is so cold that breath feels like glass in your lungs. The ground, when you can find it under all the snow and ice, is locked in permafrost so hard you could strike it with a hammer and barely leave a mark. And yet this frozen wilderness is alive. Not in the obvious way of forests or coral reefs, but in a quieter, subtler rhythm. Life here doesn't fight the cold, it learns from it. It bends with it. If you were to stand on the surface of the Arctic sea ice, you might see only a vast white plain stretching in every direction. But right beneath your feet, just centimetres below the surface, a hidden world begins. The ice, although it looks solid, is riddled with tiny channels filled with salty brine. These microscopic corridors form as seawater freezes, pushing out salt into liquid pockets that never quite solidify. In these briny veins, temperatures can drop well below zero, yet the water remains liquid. It's here that some of the most resilient organisms on Earth make their homes. Bacteria, algae, and tiny single-celled creatures drift in these thin slivers of habitat, thriving in darkness and cold that would instantly kill most life elsewhere. The remarkable thing is how ordinary they look under a microscope. No armour plating, no glowing adaptations, no alien shapes, just simple cells. But their simplicity hides an arsenal of molecular tricks. Many produce special proteins that act like antifreeze, preventing ice crystals from piercing their membranes. Others adjust their internal chemistry, packing themselves with sugars and salts that stop water inside their cells from freezing solid. Some can even shut themselves down entirely, entering a dormant state until conditions improve. These strategies aren't improvisations, they're the result of millions of years of evolution sculpting life into a form that can endure the unendurable. If you were to scoop a sample from beneath the ice and hold it to the light, you'd see a faint greenish tint. That colour comes from ice algae, one of the foundations of Arctic life. They cling to the underside of the ice in a thin layer, turning even the coldest months into a slow, quiet factory of photosynthesis. When sunlight filters through the snow in spring, those first fragile rays awaken the algae, and they bloom just as plants do in warmer places. They become the base of a food web that stretches all the way to whales. Tiny zooplankton feed on them, then fish, then seals, and eventually polar bears. All of it begins with microscopic green cells clinging to ice in sub-zero brine. It's easy to forget how delicate this balance is. The difference between life and death here can be a fraction of a degree. Too cold and the ice seals itself shut, squeezing out the brine channels. Too warm and the structure collapses into open water, flooding the creatures that rely on the steady gradient between solid and liquid. The Arctic isn't simply cold, it's precisely cold. Its ecosystems depend on an intricate dance of temperature, light and salinity, a choreography perfected over millennia. But survival here isn't only about chemistry, it's also about timing. In the Arctic, light is both the giver and taker of life. For months on end, the sun never rises, and everything plunges into darkness. Then, just as suddenly it returns, lingering on the horizon before climbing higher each day. The organisms beneath the ice have evolved to this rhythm. When the darkness begins, they slow their metabolism almost to stillness. When light returns, they surge back to life. To them, time is measured not in seconds or hours, but in the slow breathing of the seasons. Even in the dead of winter, when the ice is thick and the world above it seems utterly still, the ocean below is far from quiet. If you could drift down through a crack in the ice, you'd hear the distant groan of shifting plates, the faint clicks of crustaceans, and the deep echoing calls of whales far below. Sound travels differently in cold water, sharper, more haunting, carrying for miles through the dark. Many Arctic animals rely on that soundscape to survive. Seals use it to navigate through the maze of ice. Belugas sing to communicate and orient themselves in near blackness. For them, sound replaces sight. The darkness isn't empty. It's alive with whispers. Beneath a metre of ice, where no sunlight reaches, bacteria feed on organic material drifting down from the surface. Tiny crustaceans graze on the microbes. Fish hunt in slow motion, conserving every ounce of energy. Nothing moves quickly here because movement costs heat, and heat is precious. Every heartbeat, every flick of a fin is measured against the energy it consumes. Life here operates on a slower tempo, one that feels almost meditative. Nothing wastes effort, nothing hurries. Even the chemistry of the Arctic water changes with the seasons. In summer, when melting ice floods the surface with fresh water, sunlight penetrates deeper and algae bloom in massive numbers, painting the ocean green. As they die and sink, their remains feed entire communities on the seafloor. In winter, as the ice seals the surface again, the oxygen levels drop, nutrients shift, and another cycle begins. These cycles aren't random, they're ancient, tuned to the tilt of the Earth and the rhythm of the sun. When scientists first began drilling into Arctic ice cores, they didn't expect to find living things in samples that had been frozen solid for years. Yet when thawed and placed under the right conditions, microorganisms came back to life. Some had been dormant for decades. That discovery forced researchers to rethink the limits of biology. If something can survive inside a block of ice for half a lifetime, perhaps the boundary between life and death isn't as fixed as we thought. There's something strangely comforting in that idea. Life at its core doesn't give up easily. It adapts, waits, hides, and reawakens. Under the Arctic ice, survival isn't dramatic or loud. It's patient. It's built on resilience so quiet you could almost mistake it for stillness. What fascinates researchers most is how these organisms not only endure but continue to function. Many Arctic microbes don't just survive freezing, they actively metabolize at sub-zero temperatures. Their enzymes, tiny molecular machines that drive chemical reactions, are specially shaped to stay flexible in the cold. In most living things, cold causes proteins to stiffen and slow down. But in Arctic microbes, those same molecules are looser, wobblier, allowing life's reactions to continue even when water begins to freeze. It's a small molecular miracle repeated billions of times every second in every drop of brine beneath the ice. And they're not alone. There are small worms that live between ice crystals, feeding on bacteria. There are copepods, tiny shrimp-like creatures that drift just below the frozen ceiling, grazing on algae that bloom whenever light returns. Even larger animals like Arctic cod spend much of their lives near the underside of the ice, where food is concentrated. The ice is more than a barrier, it's a roof sheltering an entire inverted world. Every layer of that frozen ceiling tells a story. Near the surface, where air meets ice, cracks form that allow gas to pass through. Carbon dioxide seeps in and out, part of the global cycle that regulates climate. Deeper down, salts and organic compounds build up in complex patterns. Within those chemical fingerprints lie clues to how life elsewhere might adapt to similar extremes. It's one reason scientists look to the Arctic as a natural laboratory for understanding other worlds. Because the truth is, the Arctic isn't just about Earth, it's also a mirror for places beyond it. When researchers think about where life might exist elsewhere in the solar system, beneath the icy crust of Europa, the hidden oceans of Enceladus, or the frozen plains of Mars, they look here for guidance. The organisms that thrive beneath Arctic ice show us that darkness and cold aren't barriers. They're conditions to which life can adapt beautifully. Even the ice itself can act as a record keeper. Trapped inside are bubbles of ancient air, remnants of atmospheres long past. Layers form year after year, like tree rings, storing evidence of past climates, volcanic eruptions, and the rise and fall of pollutants. By studying them, scientists can trace how the planet's climate has shifted over centuries. In a sense, the Arctic ice is a memory bank of Earth itself, one that also happens to host entire living communities between its pages. If you've ever held an ice cube and watched it slowly melt in your hand, imagine that on a planetary scale. The Arctic ice is doing the same, only much more slowly and with far greater consequences. As it melts, it releases not just water but ancient organisms, gases and nutrients locked away for millennia. Some of those microbes might reawaken when they hit the sea. Others may simply dissolve, their carbon feeding the next wave of life. The cycle never truly ends. It just changes form. And change is constant here, even in a place that seems timeless. The Arctic is warming faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. Ice that once lasted year-round now vanishes in summer. With it, the delicate ecosystems below are forced to adapt again, just as they always have, though now at a pace faster than nature intended. Scientists studying these shifts aren't just watching the Arctic, they're watching the future of the planet unfold in slow motion. Still, the resilience of life here remains astonishing. Even as the ice thins, organisms find new niches. Some algae now bloom earlier, adjusting their life cycles to the changing seasons. Certain fish are venturing farther north following the cold water they depend on. It's not that the Arctic is dying, it's transforming. The story of life beneath the ice has always been one of adaptation, and that continues even now. If you were to drift under the ice right now, suspended in the slow-moving current, you might see tiny motes of light, plankton reflecting the faint glow filtering through cracks above. You might see jelly-like creatures pulsing lazily, each one a small, transparent engine of survival. And if you listen closely enough, you'd hear the rhythm of a world that never truly sleeps. The Arctic isn't silent. It hums with a low, steady life force, one that has persisted through ice ages and thaws alike. In many ways, the Arctic reminds us that life doesn't need warmth to flourish. It needs balance, adaptation, and time. The creatures beneath the ice don't resist the cold. They become part of it. Their chemistry, their behaviour, even their sense of time, all shaped by an environment most of us could barely endure for minutes. There's humility in that. As we continue deeper into this frozen realm, we'll find that what lives beneath the ice isn't simply surviving, it's redefining what survival means. If you were to float beneath that frozen ceiling long enough, letting your eyes adjust to the muted glow, you'd begin to notice movement where you expected none. Thin, ghostly tendrils of algae stretch toward faint light, like underwater meadows reaching for a sun they can barely feel. The ice above, though solid from above, forms a translucent roof laced with channels that bend and scatter light in strange ways. When the sun is low, rays slip through at odd angles, painting the water below in slow-moving stripes of green and blue. The effect is hypnotic, like sunlight filtering through stained glass, and in that dim cathedral of ice, life stirs quietly in every direction. What makes this hidden place remarkable isn't only that life exists here, but that it thrives in constant contradiction. The Arctic Sea beneath the ice is both stable and volatile. nourishing and hostile, ancient and new all at once. It is a world that doesn't simply resist extinction but builds its entire rhythm around it. At temperatures that would freeze an unprotected human in minutes, tiny organisms build communities, trade nutrients, and even compete for space. They're not just surviving, they're busy. And that busyness, invisible to us, fuels entire ecosystems stretching from the ocean floor to the edge of the atmosphere. Near the underside of the ice, brine channels widen into small cavities where saltwater pools and tiny ecosystems bloom. Diatoms, microscopic algae encased in glass-like shells, form dense mats that hang upside down like living wallpaper. Their silica skeletons sparkle faintly when disturbed, scattering light that filters through the ice. These diatoms form the cornerstone of Arctic productivity. When they bloom in spring, they release vast amounts of oxygen and organic material, feeding zooplankton that drift in lazy clouds below. Copepods, barely larger than grains of rice, feed on the diatoms, their transparent bodies filled with golden oil droplets that store energy for the long, dark months ahead. Everything here happens on a knife's edge. The diatoms must bloom at the exact moment when light returns, yet before melting begins, because once the ice starts breaking apart, the fragile ecosystem disperses. The copepods must eat enough during that short window to sustain themselves through months of darkness. The fish that depend on them, like Arctic cod, must time their spawning to match the abundance of food. A single missed cue, a few weeks of mistimed sunlight, could disrupt the entire chain. Yet year after year, despite shifting ice and unpredictable weather, the pattern continues. The timing isn't perfect, but it's good enough for life to keep finding a way. Arctic cod are small, silver fish with a talent for endurance. They spend much of their lives near the underside of the ice, swimming in slow, deliberate patterns. Their blood contains proteins that prevent it from freezing even when the surrounding water dips below zero. These antifreeze proteins latch onto ice crystals that try to form inside their bodies, stopping them from growing. It's an elegant defense, one that has fascinated scientists since it was first discovered in Antarctic species decades ago. To the cod, it's not a miracle. It's just ordinary biology, honed over millions of years. Larger predators follow the cod. Seals dive beneath the ice to hunt them, moving with quiet precision through narrow passages that shift and close without warning. A single breath taken at the surface must last for minutes, and when the air runs out, the seal must remember where the nearest hole lies. The ice is not static. It drifts, cracks, reforms. Every dive is a calculation, every return to the surface a test of memory and instinct. For a human, that uncertainty would be terrifying. For a seal, it's life. The still heart of this frozen world beats not in warmth or abundance, but in rhythm and patience. Every creature here operates on a slow pulse that mirrors the movement of the ice itself. Food is scarce, light is fleeting, and the cold never relents. Yet each species has found its place in the balance. Even when storms rage above and temperatures plunge to 40 below, the world beneath remains surprisingly calm. Currents move sluggishly, carrying nutrients from one pocket of life to another. Fish drift in silence, conserving energy. Microbes cling to surfaces, metabolizing at a pace that seems to stretch time itself. In many ways, this ecosystem is a study in efficiency. Nothing goes to waste. Organic matter that sinks from the surface is quickly recycled by bacteria. Dead plankton feed worms and amphipods on the seafloor. Their waste in turn releases nutrients that rise again toward the light, ready to feed the next generation of algae when spring returns. Every molecule of carbon, every trace of nitrogen, is passed along the chain again and again. In such an extreme environment, waste is a luxury life can't afford. Scientists studying this under-ice world often speak of it with a kind of quiet reverence. They describe the first time they lowered cameras through a hole in the ice and saw the underside glowing with life, a sight so unexpected it felt almost sacred. To reach these places, Research teams travel hundreds of kilometers over frozen seas, setting up camps that drift slowly with the pack ice. They drill through meters of solid ice to reach the water below, sending instruments into the dark. What comes back isn't chaos but order, patterns repeating across time and space, proof that even here, nature builds structure from scarcity. The data they collect help explain not only how life persists here, but why it matters far beyond the Arctic. Those microscopic algae, for example, contribute significantly to the planet's oxygen supply. When they die and sink, they carry carbon to the depths, helping regulate the global climate. The Arctic, often seen as remote and isolated, is in fact a vital organ in Earth's body, pumping energy and matter through the planetary system. The still heart beneath the ice doesn't just keep itself alive, it helps keep the world alive. It's strange to think that in total darkness, under crushing cold, the processes that stabilize the entire planet are quietly at work. But that's the Arctic's quiet secret. It doesn't shout its importance. It just continues, steady and unassuming, doing what it has always done. Even as the surface world shifts with seasons and politics and industry, this hidden ocean keeps its rhythm. Yet lately, that rhythm is beginning to change. When ice retreats earlier each summer, sunlight floods deeper into the water, triggering massive blooms of algae that grow faster but die sooner. The balance between ice algae and open water species shifts, altering what feeds whom and when. Fish that once thrived near the ice edge must travel farther to find food. Seals follow them, and polar bears follow the seals. Every adjustment ripples outward. What begins as a microscopic change in light or temperature becomes a rearrangement of the entire ecosystem. Still, adaptation remains the rule. Many Arctic organisms are astonishingly flexible. Some copepods can alter their life cycle depending on how long winter lasts, slowing their development to wait out lean years. Certain algae can survive months of darkness by switching to alternative energy sources, consuming dissolved organic matter instead of sunlight. Even bacteria adapt, forming biofilms that protect them from sudden changes in salinity as ice melts or refreezes. These are not desperate measures, they're built-in responses, ancient strategies that have seen countless winters come and go. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that this frozen sea is anything but static. It's dynamic in a way that defies intuition. Beneath the calm surface, chemical gradients shift constantly. Tiny eddies move nutrients between layers of water, linking the surface to the depths. In that movement lies continuity. Life depends on it. Even a few centimeters of mixing can determine whether a bloom thrives or fails. When winter returns and the ice thickens again, much of the life retreats into dormancy. Plankton sink into deeper layers where temperatures remain stable. Fish slow their metabolism. Seals migrate to areas with thinner ice, and the ocean grows quieter. But even then, it's not empty. The microbial world never stops. In darkness and cold, bacteria continue breaking down organic matter, releasing nutrients that will feed the spring bloom to come. It's a cycle without true endings, only transitions. There's something deeply humbling in how the Arctic turns hardship into harmony. The same forces that threaten life also sustain it. The cold that freezes water also preserves nutrients. The ice that blocks sunlight also shelters fragile communities from waves and predators. Every obstacle is also a form of protection. Every limit a source of balance. It's not a place of abundance, yet it is a place of stability, where the pace of life is matched perfectly to the pace of the environment. Sometimes scientists describe the Arctic as the planet's early warning system, a place that reacts first to global change, but it could just as easily be called its memory. The rhythms of freezing and thawing, the migrations of animals, the pulses of productivity, all of these have repeated for millennia, long before humans appeared to measure them. They're not fragile by nature, they're resilient. What makes them vulnerable now is how quickly the world above the ice is changing. Even so, the frozen ocean continues to surprise those who study it. New species are discovered every year, tiny microorganisms with genes unlike any seen before. Some produce enzymes that might one day be used in medicine or industry. Others hint at ancient evolutionary paths that branched off long before the familiar tree of life took shape. In every handful of Arctic water lies a library of genetic adaptations, each one a record of survival under conditions that push the limits of chemistry. It's easy to imagine that such a world would feel alien, but in many ways, it's profoundly connected to us. The oxygen you breathe right now carries a trace of what's produced by algae under ice. The weather patterns that govern your seasons are influenced by temperature gradients formed in the Arctic Ocean. Even the rhythm of tides and currents that regulate the planet's climate are touched by what happens beneath that frozen crust. When the Arctic breathes, the Earth feels it. If you could stay long enough beneath the ice, you'd see seasons shift in slow motion. The first faint light of returning spring would coax colour back into the water. The algae would awaken, the copepods would rise, fish would follow, and predators would return to the hunt. The entire system, dormant for months, would surge back into motion as if nothing had paused. To witness that rebirth is to see resilience made visible. It reminds us that life doesn't simply exist, it persists, adapting quietly to whatever the world asks of it. The still heart of this living world beats not in defiance of the cold, but in harmony with it. The ice is both boundary and foundation, both challenge and sanctuary. Every organism beneath it, from the smallest microbe to the largest whale, has learned to read its shifting patterns and to find opportunity in its limitations. That quiet persistence defines the Arctic more than its cold ever could. And as we drift deeper into this hidden realm, we begin to see that the story of survival here isn't about endurance alone. It's about cooperation between species, between elements, between the living and the frozen. In the next step of our journey, that cooperation becomes even clearer as we explore what it truly means to live in a world without sunlight. When the Arctic winter settles in, light becomes a memory. The sun dips below the horizon and stays there, sometimes for months. Above the ice, darkness spreads across the land like a slow-moving tide. Below it, that darkness deepens into something almost tangible. The faint green shimmer that once filtered through the ice vanishes completely, and the under-ice world enters what seems like an endless night. For most forms of life, such a loss would mean extinction. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stops. Plants can't grow, food chains collapse. But here, under the frozen surface, existence has found another rhythm. Where light fails, chemistry and patience take over. It's difficult to imagine total darkness when you live in a world where light is always available, even in the dead of night. But beneath several meters of ice, there are no shades, no glow from the moon, no reflections. The absence of light isn't simply a visual change, it's a shift in physics and biology. Temperature drops, pressure changes, behavior transforms. What was once a world painted in faint blue and green becomes a shadowed landscape of faint movements and unseen interactions. The creatures that remain here don't see in the way we do. Some rely on vibrations, others on chemical cues, and many on sound. For the microbes and algae that depend on light, the long polar night might seem like a sentence. Yet they've evolved to treat it as a season, not an ending. As daylight fades, ice algae enter a state of dormancy. Their metabolic rate slows almost to zero. Inside their cells, they store energy in the form of lipids and sugars, molecular fuel reserves that can last through the long winter. They stop dividing, stop growing, and simply wait. It's a kind of patience most living things couldn't endure. When the first hint of light returns months later, these same cells wake again, ready to resume where they left off. For those that can't wait, evolution has provided alternatives. Some species of bacteria and archaea that live under the ice aren't dependent on sunlight at all. They draw their energy from chemistry instead of photons. Through processes like chemosynthesis, they use the oxidation of compounds such as ammonia, sulfur, or methane to create energy-rich molecules. It's the same strategy used by microbes living around deep-sea hydrothermal vents thousands of kilometers away, where sunlight never reaches. The Arctic under-ice world is, in many ways, a mirror of those distant ecosystems. A dark, cold, high-pressure environment where chemistry replaces sunlight as the spark of life. In this deep winter, food webs rearrange themselves. With photosynthetic production halted, animals that rely on algae and plankton must find new sources of nourishment. Some copepods and small crustaceans migrate to deeper layers of water where they can feed on detritus, tiny fragments of organic material that drift downward like snow. Others rely on fat reserves built up during the summer bloom, converting that stored energy slowly, molecule by molecule, as the months pass. Everything here depends on efficiency. Nothing is wasted, and nothing moves faster than it must. Fish, too, slow their lives. Arctic cod reduce their activity to the bare minimum. They hover near the ice, conserving energy. Their metabolism drops, their movements become slow and deliberate, and their heartbeat slows. For them, winter is not a battle, it's an intermission. Survival here depends less on strength and more on timing, on knowing when to move and when to wait. Larger animals like seals and whales adapt in other ways. Beluga whales, often called sea canaries for their rich range of vocalizations, navigate and hunt through sound. During the polar night, they become almost entirely dependent on echolocation, sending out clicks that bounce off prey and obstacles, mapping their surroundings through echoes. For them, sound becomes a substitute for sight. The Arctic Ocean in winter might look silent to us, but through their ears it's full of information. Each reflection of sound tells a story about what lies nearby. A school of fish, an ice wall, or another whale calling in the distance. The absence of sunlight also reshapes the chemistry of the water itself. Without the daily cycle of warming and cooling driven by light, temperature gradients flatten. Layers of water mix more slowly, oxygen levels shift. The entire environment becomes more uniform, more still. In that stillness, chemical processes that would normally be overshadowed by biological activity begin to dominate. Methane, produced by the slow decay of organic matter trapped in sediments, seeps upward in small bubbles. Nitrate and sulfate cycle through bacterial communities that live on the seafloor. It's a world running on stored energy, like a great engine idling through the dark. When scientists study this period, they're often surprised by how much activity continues even without sunlight. Using remote sensors, they've detected faint pulses of biological activity throughout the winter. Small spikes in oxygen production suggest that some photosynthesis continues, perhaps from organisms using minimal light from the moon, or from the faint glow of aurora filtering through cracks in the ice. Others speculate that certain Arctic algae have evolved pigments so efficient they can harvest photons that most plants would never notice. Even in near darkness, life finds a way to keep its machinery running. For humans, the concept of months without sunlight is deeply unsettling. We're creatures of rhythm, tied to day and night cycles. The Arctic's unbroken night feels unnatural to us, but to its inhabitants, it's simply part of the pattern. The animals here have internal clocks, circadian rhythms, that adjust not to daily light, but to annual cycles. They know when the sun will vanish and when it will return, guided not by sight but by temperature, magnetic fields, and subtle chemical changes in the water. Their physiology doesn't fight the darkness, it expects it. There's an efficiency to this that feels almost elegant. Where we might see deprivation, Arctic life sees structure. When the light disappears, the ecosystem doesn't collapse. It reorganizes. Predators that rely on sight withdraw or change their hunting methods. Scavengers move in. Microbes shift from photosynthesis to chemical energy. Everything adjusts in sequence, and the entire system keeps turning. Beneath the ice, the night also changes the social behaviour of larger animals. Walruses, for instance, gather in tight groups, using body heat to conserve warmth when resting on ice floes. Polar bears range farther, relying on scent more than sight to find breathing holes used by seals. Even the smallest creatures sense these changes. Zooplankton that normally follow vertical migrations, rising to feed at night and sinking by day, must adjust when night lasts for months. Some continue their cycles based on internal timing alone, moving up and down through the dark as if the sun still rose and set. This internal persistence fascinates researchers. It suggests that biological rhythms don't depend entirely on external light, but on inherited timing mechanisms refined by evolution. The Arctic's long night becomes a test of how deeply time is encoded into life itself. When everything external disappears, light, warmth, even sound, what remains is the rhythm written into DNA. As the months pass, subtle signs of change begin to appear. The stars above the ice slowly shift position, signalling that the sun is inching closer to the horizon again. Beneath the ice, the temperature rises by a fraction of a degree. It's enough. Some organisms begin to stir earlier than others, sensing that the long dark is ending. The smallest shifts trigger cascading responses. Bacteria become more active, releasing nutrients which feed dormant algae, which in turn attract the first hungry zooplankton emerging from their rest. It's like an orchestra tuning itself in anticipation of the first light. When the sun finally returns, the transformation is almost immediate. A faint glow begins to filter through the ice, growing brighter each day. For months, energy has been stored, conserved, hidden away. Now it floods back into the system. The algae that have waited so long burst into growth, releasing oxygen and sugars into the water. Plankton populations explode. The ocean, silent for months, comes alive again. But it's the darkness that made this moment possible. Without that long period of rest, the ecosystem could never sustain its explosive productivity in spring. The night is not an interruption, it's a necessary pause. There's a lesson in that balance, one that scientists often point out when they study extreme environments. Life in the Arctic doesn't chase constant activity. It embraces cycles of abundance and scarcity, of light and dark, and in doing so, it achieves stability that more temperate systems rarely match. The Arctic doesn't waste energy trying to defy its conditions, it uses them. When we look at photographs of the polar night, we often focus on the beauty of the aurora, those green and violet ribbons swirling across the sky. But what's happening below, unseen, is just as astonishing. The faint electromagnetic energy from those auroras interacts with particles in the atmosphere, which then drift down into the ocean. Some researchers believe this interaction may even influence certain microbial processes, though the details are still uncertain. What's clear is that even the distant energy of the sun, carried through magnetic fields and charged particles, eventually reaches the deep Arctic in some form. The system is connected from top to bottom, even when it appears cut off from the world. In the middle of the long dark, when temperatures reach their lowest, the Arctic Ocean holds its breath. Yet even then, beneath kilometres of frozen silence, there is motion. Water circulates slowly through under-ice currents, driven by differences in salinity and temperature. These currents bring oxygen to deeper layers and distribute nutrients. They're the arteries of this frozen ocean, keeping it alive when everything else seems still. Without them, the entire ecosystem would suffocate long before spring. Studying this under-ice world during the polar night is one of the hardest challenges in marine science. Equipment freezes, batteries fail, and navigation becomes nearly impossible. Researchers often describe the experience as operating in another world. The cold bites through every layer of insulation, and the darkness feels endless. Yet the data they bring back is invaluable. It tells us that life never fully stops, that even in conditions most would call lifeless, biological activity continues quietly, almost invisibly. That persistence has implications far beyond the Arctic. When scientists search for life on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, they look for signs of similar chemical processes, life that feeds on energy stored in molecules rather than sunlight. The Arctic winter, in that sense, serves as a model for extraterrestrial survival. It shows that darkness and cold don't define lifelessness, they define a different kind of living. Back under the ice, as months of night begin to give way to the first glow of returning dawn, the transformation is subtle at first. The animals don't celebrate, they adjust. The plankton that have drifted nearly motionless for months begin to rise again toward the faint light. Bacteria accelerate their metabolism, small fish start to hunt with more energy. The darkness loosens its hold slowly, as if reluctant to leave. When sunlight finally reaches full strength, it finds a world ready for it, not one waiting helplessly in the cold. To call this place a world without sunlight isn't entirely accurate. The light is absent, but its memory remains in every organism that survives here. They carry the pattern of brightness and shadow in their genes, in their chemistry, in the shape of their behaviour. They don't need light to know it will come back. They're built for the return. And as we drift upward, following the first scattered photons breaking through cracks in the ice, it becomes clear that this hidden world isn't defined by its darkness, but by how gracefully it moves through it. What seems like stillness is really preparation, and what seems like emptiness is full of life rearranging itself for another cycle. Soon, we'll move deeper into the question of how that life endures on a molecular level, how cells resist freezing, how proteins keep working when everything else would turn brittle, how living matter speaks the language of cold without ever falling silent. Beneath the ice, the air that sustains life is locked away. Above, the wind roars freely across the frozen plains, but down here, oxygen moves slowly, dissolved in the cold water, rationed carefully by the living things that depend on it. To breathe in a place like this is not an automatic act. It's an achievement. The creatures that survive here have learned to pull oxygen from scarcity itself, to recycle it, to make do with the barest whisper of what most of the planet takes for granted. It is one of the most difficult challenges of life beneath the Arctic ice, finding a way to keep the spark of metabolism burning in an environment that constantly tries to smother it. Oxygen is essential because it acts as a kind of biological currency. In most organisms, it's what allows cells to extract energy from food efficiently. Without it, the process becomes slow and clumsy. In the Arctic Ocean, oxygen enters the water from the air above, dissolving into the surface before slowly spreading downward. But under a thick, unbroken sheet of ice, that exchange nearly stops. The ice acts like a lid on a jar, sealing the ocean below from direct contact with the atmosphere. The only oxygen that reaches these waters comes from what little remains after the last thaw, or from tiny cracks where wind and water occasionally meet. In winter, those exchanges can almost vanish, yet life keeps breathing. For many Arctic microorganisms, oxygen scarcity isn't a crisis. It's an old companion. Some have developed pathways that let them extract energy without it. Instead of using oxygen to break down sugars or fats, they rely on other molecules, nitrates, sulfates, even iron, to complete their metabolic reactions. It's a process known as anaerobic respiration, and though it yields less energy, it allows them to keep functioning when oxygen is gone. Deep in the sediments below the ice, entire communities of bacteria live this way, converting chemicals into energy in total darkness, never once taking in a breath as we know it. There's a quiet efficiency to these systems. Microbes living in oxygen-poor conditions often work in teams, passing molecules from one species to another like assembly line workers. One group breaks down large organic compounds into smaller fragments. Another converts those fragments into simpler molecules. A third finishes the job producing byproducts like methane or nitrogen gas that drift upward through the water. Each step releases a little energy, enough to keep cells alive and reproducing. These networks of cooperation make the most of every bit of matter that falls from above. Nothing is wasted, not even breath. For larger animals, the problem is more immediate. Fish and invertebrates need oxygen in their blood to fuel muscles and maintain temperature. The colder the water, the more oxygen it can technically hold, but the less movement there is to bring it to where it's needed. Arctic fish have solved this paradox in several ingenious ways. Some, like the polar cod, have blood with a remarkable capacity for oxygen binding. Their hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen, is adapted to grab onto it tightly, even when levels are low. This allows them to survive in water, where oxygen concentration would suffocate most species. Others take a more radical approach. Certain species of fish that live near freezing temperatures have evolved blood that carries no hemoglobin at all. The Antarctic icefish, a close relative of some Arctic species, is completely transparent inside and out, its blood clear because it lacks red blood cells. It survives by absorbing oxygen directly through its skin and gills into plasma. At first glance, this seems impossible. Yet in the frigid water, oxygen dissolves so readily that this direct diffusion is enough. The absence of red blood cells also makes the blood thinner and easier to pump, an advantage in the cold, where fluids tend to become viscous. Even the smallest creatures take advantage of the environment's chemistry. Under the ice, microalgae form dense mats that photosynthesize whenever faint light returns. In doing so, they release oxygen directly into the brine channels where they live. The bubbles accumulate in tiny pockets, forming local oases of higher oxygen concentration that other organisms exploit. Small invertebrates gather near these spots, feeding and breathing where the air is richest. It's a miniature version of a forest, where producers and consumers coexist in a carefully balanced cycle. When light disappears entirely during the polar night, these algae switch strategies. They begin to rely on stored energy, and oxygen levels drop again. To survive this, animals like copepods enter states of torpor, drastically reducing their need for oxygen. Their hearts slow, their movement nearly stops. They drift in the dark, half asleep, waiting for the return of conditions that will allow them to breathe more freely again. To them, survival isn't about endurance in the usual sense, it's about control, about knowing exactly how to balance the thin line between activity and stillness. The absence of oxygen doesn't mean the absence of life. In fact, low oxygen environments often host some of the most diverse microbial communities on Earth. Beneath the Arctic ice, these organisms form mats, films and aggregates that look almost like thin frost. They cling to surfaces, coating sediments, rocks, and even the undersides of ice floes. Within these layers, gradients of chemistry emerge. The uppermost layer might contain just enough oxygen for aerobic respiration. Beneath it, oxygen disappears, and anaerobic processes take over. Each layer supports a different community, creating a stratified ecosystem measured in millimeters but capable of sustaining astonishing complexity. Researchers who sample these biofilms often find bacteria that can switch between breathing oxygen and other compounds as conditions change. They're metabolic chameleons, adapting minute by minute. This flexibility gives them an advantage not only in the Arctic, but also in any environment where resources fluctuate. It's a kind of built-in resilience, a reminder that life rarely commits to a single strategy when it can have several. In many ways, the Arctic Ocean's oxygen cycle mirrors the planet's own. During the brief summer, when sunlight floods the water, photosynthetic organisms produce vast amounts of oxygen. Some of it escapes through melting ice into the atmosphere. Some remains trapped below, fueling life through the following winter. It's a seasonal breathing pattern, the ocean exhaling in summer and inhaling through the long night. Even the ice itself participates. Tiny cracks and leads, narrow openings between drifting flows, allow bursts of gas exchange that refresh the trapped air below. For a few days at a time, the ocean takes a deep breath before the surface seals again. For humans studying the system, understanding how it maintains balance is crucial. The Arctic plays a major role in the global carbon and oxygen cycles. The microorganisms that fix carbon under the ice also release oxygen that contributes, in small but measurable ways, to the atmosphere. When that balance shifts, as it does now with warming temperatures and thinning ice, the consequences ripple far beyond the polar regions. Changes in Arctic oxygen levels can alter the chemistry of entire ocean basins, influencing everything from plankton populations to the behaviour of larger marine species thousands of kilometres away. The ice itself is not a barrier so much as a mediator. In some places, brine channels act as pathways connecting the ocean to the air. As salt water seeps upward through microscopic cracks, gases escape or enter depending on pressure differences. These exchanges are subtle, often occurring on scales smaller than a grain of sand, but multiplied across the vast Arctic expanse, they represent an enormous flow of matter. It's a reminder that even in a place that appears sealed, nothing is truly closed. The system breathes, slowly, quietly, but continuously. Below the ice, oxygen levels can vary dramatically within just a few centimetres. In some spots, conditions become completely anoxic, devoid of oxygen. In others, concentrations remain high, thanks to trapped air bubbles or local photosynthesis. These microhabitats allow different species to coexist, each specialising in a narrow range of conditions. For a bacterium adapted to zero oxygen, even a brief exposure to air can be lethal. For another, the absence of oxygen is equally deadly, so they partition space with remarkable precision, forming a mosaic of life where chemistry determines geography. Among these microscopic survivors, one group stands out for its importance: the nitrifying and denitrifying bacteria. They manage the flow of nitrogen through the ecosystem, converting ammonia to nitrate and back again, balancing the nutrient cycles that feed algae and other organisms. Without them, the Arctic Ocean would quickly run out of usable nitrogen, halting the growth of the very organisms that produce oxygen. In that sense, even the act of breathing here is a community effort. Every exchange of gas, every molecule recycled, depends on countless invisible participants performing their parts in perfect coordination. Some researchers have likened this system to a slow heartbeat. During the long night, the pulse weakens, oxygen dwindles, and activity subsides. When sunlight returns, the pulse strengthens again, oxygen surges and life bursts into motion. The Arctic breathes in its own time, guided not by seconds or minutes but by the movement of seasons and ice. To stand on the surface of that frozen ocean and know that beneath you this enormous silent respiration continues is to feel something that transcends scale. The smallest cell and the largest whale are both part of the same slow inhale and exhale. For larger marine mammals, breathing beneath the ice is literal and constant. Seals and whales must surface regularly to exchange air, but the ice often covers the ocean for hundreds of kilometres without a single opening. They memorise the locations of breathing holes, some of which are only the width of their bodies. They navigate between them by instinct, sonar and memory. The stakes are absolute. Missing a hole can mean suffocation, and yet they manage it, generation after generation, tracing invisible maps beneath the ice with astonishing precision. Their lungs, muscles and blood are adapted for this life. They store oxygen not just in the lungs but in the muscles themselves, bound to myoglobin, a molecule similar to hemoglobin, but even more concentrated. This allows them to dive for 20 minutes, sometimes longer, without needing to surface. The Arctic seals in particular demonstrate how seamlessly biology integrates with environment. When they dive, their heart rate slows dramatically, sometimes to just a few beats per minute. Blood flow to non-essential organs decreases, conserving oxygen for the brain and heart. Their bodies shift into a temporary state where every molecule of oxygen is accounted for, none wasted. Then, when they rise to the surface and find an opening, They exhale explosively, a sharp burst of steam against the frozen air, and take another deep breath before vanishing again. Each breath is a negotiation between life and the elements. Even the presence of these mammals contributes to the ecosystem's balance. Their breathing holes, maintained by constant use, become crucial access points for other animals and for the exchange of gases between ocean and atmosphere. Through them, oxygen enters and carbon dioxide leaves. It's an odd thought that the act of a seal surfacing to breathe helps an entire ecosystem maintain its equilibrium, but that's exactly what happens. The line between individual survival and planetary function blurs beneath the ice. If we could map every source and sink of oxygen in this environment, the result would look less like a simple flow chart and more like a network of threads, each one pulsing faintly with life. Some are ancient, maintained by microbial lineages that have survived countless ice ages. Others are newer, emerging as the climate changes and ice retreats, opening new pathways for exchange. The Arctic's breath, once slow and predictable, is beginning to quicken in places, to stutter in others, and with that change the creatures that depend on it must adapt once more. Yet even as conditions shift, the ingenuity of life here remains unbroken. New bacterial communities form in melting ice, colonizing the edges of thawing pools. Fish adjust their migration routes to follow oxygen-rich waters. Seals learn to navigate thinner ice and longer distances between breathing holes. The pattern holds. The Arctic keeps breathing, even when the rhythm changes. In the end, what happens beneath the ice is not a miracle, but a demonstration of how life fits itself to every possible condition. Where air is scarce, organisms find ways to replace it, stretch it, or live without it altogether. The concept of breathing expands beyond lungs and gills, becoming something broader. The exchange of matter and energy that keeps existence in motion. Beneath the Arctic ice, breathing isn't just about air, it's about persistence. It's about the endless creativity of biology, rewriting its own rules to match the cold logic of the environment. And as we move forward into the next part of this journey, that creativity becomes even more remarkable. To survive here isn't only to breathe differently, it's to think in the language of cold itself, to let the body's chemistry and structure adjust to temperatures that would freeze steel, and yet still, somehow, remain alive. The cold here is not a sensation, it's a substance. It shapes everything it touches, pressing itself into every cell, every molecule, until survival becomes a matter of chemistry. The water beneath the Arctic ice hovers just above its freezing point. The difference between fluidity and solidity is measured in tenths of a degree. To live here is to exist on that razor edge, or even a minor shift in temperature could turn life itself into crystal. Yet life does not shatter, it endures. Over millions of years, organisms have learned not just to resist the cold, but to use it, to build their bodies and their processes around its unrelenting precision. The challenge begins at the molecular level. When temperatures drop, water behaves differently. It expands as it freezes, forming sharp, orderly crystals that can tear through cells like splinters of glass. The first rule of survival in the Arctic, then, is simple. Prevent ice from forming inside your body. Every living thing beneath the ice obeys this rule, each in its own way. Some produce antifreeze proteins that bind to forming crystals and stop them from growing. These proteins don't melt ice. They merely halt its progress, keeping it small enough to avoid damage. Others alter the chemistry of their fluids, increasing the concentration of salts or sugars that lower the freezing point. These adaptations turn the organism's interior into something closer to a syrup than water, viscous, slow-moving, resistant to crystallization. In fish like the Arctic cod, these antifreeze molecules circulate through the bloodstream, coating the cells in a microscopic layer of protection. It's an invisible armor that allows them to swim in water that should have frozen them solid. When scientists first discovered these proteins, they were astonished by their effectiveness. A few milligrams in a litre of water can prevent freezing several degrees below zero. Nature, it seemed, had perfected a kind of molecular engineering that human technology was only beginning to understand. Other species take an entirely different approach. Instead of preventing freezing, they allow it, but in a controlled way. Some insects, small crustaceans, and even certain microbes are what scientists call freeze-tolerant. They let ice form within their bodies, but only in specific places, keeping it away from vital organs or cell interiors. They achieve this by producing nucleating proteins that encourage ice to grow where it's safest, such as between cells or within extracellular spaces. At the same time, they fill their cells with glycerol and other cryoprotectants that prevent internal freezing. When temperatures drop, their bodies gradually solidify and metabolic processes nearly stop. When warmth returns, the ice melts, and they resume life as if nothing had happened. It's not dormancy in the usual sense. It's controlled suspension, a biochemical pause button. For microbes trapped inside ice crystals, survival means adaptation to a world of near stillness. Inside brine channels, water molecules move so slowly that chemical reactions can take days or even weeks to complete. Enzymes, the proteins that drive those reactions, must remain flexible enough to function despite the cold. In most organisms, low temperatures make enzymes rigid, unable to change shape and perform their work, but in Arctic microbes, evolution has reshaped them. Their structures are looser, their bonds weaker, allowing motion even when everything else slows. It's a subtle but crucial adjustment. These cold-adapted enzymes operate efficiently at temperatures that would render others inert. If you were to warm them to room temperature, they'd fall apart. They are designed specifically for the cold, specialized tools for a narrow but essential purpose. This fine-tuning extends to cell membranes as well. The outer layer of a cell must remain flexible enough to contain its contents without breaking. In cold conditions, fats and lipids tend to solidify, turning the membrane stiff and brittle. Arctic organisms counter this by altering the composition of their lipids, incorporating more unsaturated fatty acids that stay fluid even in freezing water. The result is a living barrier that bends but never cracks, a film of molecular resilience that allows nutrients and signals to move freely in and out of the cell. Every cell beneath the ice is a small act of engineering perfection, balanced between fluidity and structure. In larger animals, the cold dictates not just biochemistry, but behavior and physiology. Seals and whales, though warm-blooded, must still cope with extreme temperature gradients between the air, the ice, and the water. They rely on thick layers of blubber to insulate their bodies, but that's only part of the solution. Their circulatory systems are arranged in countercurrent loops. Arteries carrying warm blood from the core run alongside veins, returning cold blood from the skin. Heat transfers from one to the other, keeping the core warm and preventing energy loss. It's a system so efficient that engineers have studied it for use in heat exchangers and spacecraft. Nature, as always, solved it first. Even the simplest organisms show similar efficiency at smaller scales. Tiny crustaceans reduce their surface area relative to volume, minimizing heat loss. Some adopt spherical shapes, which are thermodynamically advantageous. Others move less frequently, reducing friction and conserving energy. Over time, every aspect of their form has been sculpted by the cold. In the Arctic, evolution is not a process of adding more features, but of removing everything unnecessary. What remains is function distilled to its essence. To live at these temperatures is to exist in slow motion. Chemical reactions proceed gradually, cell division slows, and growth can take years. But slowness here isn't weakness, it's stability. In the rush of temperate environments, life must constantly adapt to rapid change. Here, change comes so slowly that organisms can perfect their responses. A bacterium that divides once every few weeks might seem inefficient, yet its descendants have persisted for tens of thousands of years, enduring conditions that would annihilate faster-growing species. The Arctic rewards patience over speed. Some scientists see in this slowness a glimpse of the earliest life on Earth. Billions of years ago, before the planet warmed, the oceans may have resembled today's polar seas, cold, dim, chemically active. The adaptations we see in Arctic microbes could be echoes of those ancient strategies. The ability to function at low temperatures, to maintain flexibility and reaction in near-freezing conditions, might not be a recent invention, but a memory from life's origins. In that sense, the Arctic is not just an extreme environment, it's a time capsule. In the modern world, we often think of cold as an obstacle, something to overcome, but in biology it can be an ally. Cold slows decay, preserves structure, and prevents chaos. It provides stability, the very foundation upon which complex life can build. The Arctic ecosystem depends on that stability. Without the cold, the slow processes that define its balance, the careful cycling of nutrients, the deliberate pace of reproduction, would collapse into disorder. The cold is not an enemy here. It's the architect. That architecture extends into the ice itself. Within its crystalline lattice, microhabitats form where temperature, salinity, and pressure interact in unique combinations. Some of these niches remain stable for years, hosting microbial communities that evolve independently from the surrounding ocean. Genetic analyses have revealed surprising diversity in these frozen populations. Bacteria that differ significantly, even between ice layers just centimeters apart. Each microenvironment becomes a miniature laboratory for evolution, where small mutations can lead to dramatic shifts in function. Some of these genetic innovations have already found uses in biotechnology, from enzymes that work in industrial freezers to antifreeze proteins now being tested for preserving organs during transplant. The solutions life discovered here are finding their way into human technology, though we're still only beginning to understand them. Yet even these highly specialized adaptations have limits. There are thresholds below which metabolism can no longer function, where the structure of molecules themselves becomes unstable. In laboratory studies, scientists have cooled Arctic microbes to temperatures approaching -20 degrees Celsius and found that while many cells remain intact, their activity stops entirely. They are not dead, but they are not alive in any conventional sense either. They exist in suspension, a biological limbo waiting for warmth to return. When thawed, many revive, resuming activity within hours. This ability to pause and restart life is one of the most extraordinary features of the polar biosphere. It challenges our very definition of what it means to be alive. For larger organisms, the challenge of managing cold extends beyond chemistry into perception and movement. Nerves conduct signals more slowly in cold tissue. Muscles contract less efficiently. To compensate, Arctic animals adjust their internal physiology. They produce special proteins that maintain ion balance across nerve membranes, ensuring that communication between brain and body remains reliable. Some fish even generate small amounts of internal heat in their eyes and brains to keep vision and reaction sharp while the rest of the body remains near freezing. It's not much, fractions of a degree, but it's enough to maintain function. At the same time, many species use the environment itself as part of their thermal strategy. Seals bask near cracks in the ice, where slightly warmer air rises from the ocean. Certain invertebrates seek out brine channels, where the salt lowers the freezing point and creates slightly warmer microclimates. These are not conscious choices in the human sense, but evolved instincts honed by countless generations of trial and error. Each behavior is a chemical adjustment expressed through movement. The language of cold is written in molecules, but it's spoken by entire ecosystems. When the temperature drops, reactions slow in predictable patterns, triggering responses at every level of life. Metabolism shifts, growth halts, feeding behavior changes, migration begins. These signals travel through the web of life like a slow pulse, synchronizing thousands of species. There is no central control, no conductor. The system organizes itself through feedback, through chemistry, through the shared constraint of temperature. In this sense, the Arctic functions less like a battlefield and more like an orchestra. Each species plays its part in harmony with the others, responding to the cues of cold rather than resisting them. It's a collective adaptation, a shared understanding among living things that the key to survival lies not in defiance but in agreement. The cold sets the tempo, and life keeps time. The more we study these systems, the clearer it becomes that temperature is not simply a background condition. It's a force that shapes evolution as surely as natural selection itself. The traits that define Arctic species, antifreeze proteins, flexible enzymes, lipid membranes, slow metabolisms, are not random innovations, but the vocabulary of a language spoken fluently only in the coldest parts of the world. To understand it fully is to grasp how deeply life can adapt, how far chemistry can be stretched before it breaks. Even now, as the Arctic warms and the boundaries of cold retreat, the legacy of this language remains imprinted in the genomes of its inhabitants. Some species may move northward, others may vanish, but the molecular strategies that once kept them alive will persist, encoded in DNA, ready to be called upon again whenever the planet cools. The story of life beneath the ice is not just about endurance in the present, it's about memory across time. And as we move deeper into this world, that memory expands beyond chemistry into structure, into the way living things physically shape and are shaped by the ice around them. In the cold, even architecture becomes biological. The creatures here are not merely residents of the frozen world, they are its builders, its engineers, forming a living architecture of ice and shadow that sustains everything else. If you could peel back the surface of the Arctic ice and look closely enough, you would see that it isn't uniform or smooth. It's a landscape in miniature, a world of peaks, valleys, and hollow corridors sculpted by salt, temperature, and movement. Light filters through in thin ribbons refracted and bent by imperfections in the ice, casting pale green shadows across the water below. Within these spaces, life doesn't just exist, it builds. The creatures that inhabit this realm are not only shaped by their environment, but shape it in return. They carve their world molecule by molecule, turning solid ice into a living architecture. The process begins at the smallest scale. When seawater freezes, salt is pushed aside, forming concentrated brine channels within the ice. These channels twist and connect like a network of blood vessels, providing passageways for microbes, nutrients, and gases. Within them, bacteria and algae find a foothold. Their growth changes the chemistry of the surrounding brine, altering its acidity, viscosity, and structure. Over time, these subtle modifications expand the channels, transforming rigid ice into a porous matrix full of microhabitats. Each species leaves its signature on the structure, a physical imprint of its presence. The ice becomes alive not just with organisms, but with their influence. Ice algae are the principal architect of this hidden world. They form dense films that line the undersides of ice floes, binding themselves to the irregular surfaces with sticky secretions. These secretions, made of long chains of sugars, act like glue, stabilizing the fragile boundary between ice and water. They trap sediment, nutrients, and even tiny air bubbles, creating a thin but remarkably stable layer where life can flourish. This slim zone, often only a few millimeters thick, supports an entire food web that stretches deep into the sea below. It is, in effect, a foundation, a biological crust that anchors the Arctic ecosystem. The patterns formed by these algae are intricate. Under a microscope, the biofilms resemble cities seen from the air, with clusters of cells forming around nutrient-rich zones and open spaces allowing for the flow of water. The texture of the ice itself mirrors this organization. As the algae excrete organic material, it changes how water freezes and melts, softening some regions while hardening others. Light passes through unevenly, creating localized patches of brightness that encourage further growth. The feedback loop is constant. Life modifies the ice, and the ice in turn dictates how life grows. This self-reinforcing relationship is one of the Arctic's defining features. The boundaries between the physical and the biological blur. Ice crystals grow differently in the presence of organic matter. Salt concentrations shift in response to microbial metabolism. Even the colour of the ice can change as algae bloom, tinting the underside a faint greenish brown. Each winter, new ice forms, and the process begins again, but traces of the old communities remain. Fragments of organic carbon, preserved patterns of brine channels, microscopic fossils frozen in place. Over time, these layers accumulate, storing a record of biological activity year by year. The ice becomes a living archive. In the narrow cracks where light seeps through, larger organisms begin to appear. Tiny crustaceans, amphipods and copepods swim upside down along the ice's underside, grazing on algae. Their movements stir the water, distributing nutrients and oxygen. As they feed, they leave behind waste that sinks slowly into the depths, providing food for bottom-dwelling organisms. The simple act of grazing sustains an invisible rain of organic material that nourishes the entire ocean below. These small creatures, though unremarkable in appearance, are essential engineers. They control the flow of energy through the ecosystem, connecting the ice world above with the benthic communities below. Some amphipods have even evolved to match the colour and texture of the ice, blending seamlessly into their surroundings. Their bodies are covered in fine, transparent hairs that reduce reflection, making them almost invisible to predators. They cling to the rough undersides of ice floes, moving deliberately, scraping off algae and bacteria. Their activity prevents overgrowth and maintains the delicate balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the microenvironment. They are the gardeners of this frozen realm, pruning and cleaning without ever realizing the importance of their role. Larger animals also play their part in shaping the ice. When seals haul themselves out to rest or give birth, their weight presses depressions into the surface, altering how snow accumulates and melts. When they slide back into the water, the edges of the ice fracture, creating leads, openings that allow sunlight to penetrate deeper. Whales, surfacing to breathe, keep certain areas ice-free year-round, ensuring that oxygen exchange continues. Even polar bears, though often seen as isolated wanderers, contribute to this dynamic landscape by breaking through thin ice while hunting. Each interaction modifies the physical world, making it more permeable, more alive. The interplay between ice and biology is so intricate that scientists often describe it as a form of coevolution. The organisms have not merely adapted to the ice ice itself has adapted to them. In laboratory studies, researchers have found that the structure of sea ice formed in sterile water differs from that of natural ice. Without life, the crystalline network is more rigid, less porous, less dynamic. Introduce microbes and organic compounds, and the ice becomes more flexible, capable of supporting circulation and gas exchange. The very properties that define Arctic ice, its texture, its permeability, its fragility, may owe their existence to the organisms that inhabit it. This interdependence extends deep into the ocean. When ice melts in spring, the algae and bacteria attached to it are released, drifting downward in vast numbers. They form a seasonal pulse of organic matter known as the ice melt bloom, one of the most important feeding events in the polar year. Zooplankton gather in dense swarms to feed, followed by fish, then seals, then whales. The sudden influx of food supports an explosion of activity that ripples through the entire ecosystem. The architecture built during winter, those thin films of life, those microscopic brine networks, becomes the foundation for summer abundance. Without the builders of ice, there would be no feast below. As the seasons turn and temperatures drop again, a reverse process begins. The ice reforms, and the builders return. Algae settle once more beneath the growing ice sheets. Microbes infiltrate the forming brine channels, ready to sculpt the new architecture. It's a cycle that repeats with astonishing consistency, each generation inheriting not only genetic instructions but physical space shaped by those before. The Arctic is rebuilt each year from the bottom up, one cell at a time. For scientists, the recognition that life and ice co-create each other has profound implications. It suggests that biology can shape geology on even the smaller scales. The same principles seen here, organic molecules influencing crystal formation, microorganisms altering mineral structures, may operate elsewhere, from glaciers on Earth to the icy shells of distant moons. The Arctic becomes not just a local phenomenon, but a model for how life and environment intertwine across the cosmos. Within this frozen architecture, chemical communication plays a crucial role. Microbes release signaling molecules that allow them to coordinate behavior, to regulate when to form biofilms, when to reproduce, when to go dormant. These exchanges happen invisibly, yet they guide the development of entire communities. In the brine channels, these signals diffuse slowly, creating gradients that other organisms can detect and follow. It's a kind of navigation system written in chemistry, guiding life through a maze of frozen corridors. The structure of the ice amplifies this communication. Because diffusion is slow, molecules linger, allowing signals to persist longer and reach farther. The result is a stable network where information moves at the same deliberate pace as the environment itself. In this way, the ice becomes not just a physical scaffold, but a medium for communication, a frozen internet connecting millions of microscopic architects. Light too plays its part in shaping this architecture. Even in winter, when sunlight barely grazes the horizon, faint illumination filters through cracks and thin ice. The direction and colour of that light determine where algae grow, where biofilms thicken, where predators hunt. Under certain conditions, the light reflects repeatedly within the ice, creating regions of concentrated brightness known as light wells. These wells serve as focal points for productivity, drawing organisms from all around. The interaction between structure and light creates a patchwork of habitats that shift constantly as ice drifts and melts. When the first explorers ventured into the Arctic centuries ago, they described the ice as static, a frozen desert. Now, with advanced imaging and sensors, we know it is anything but. The underside of the ice moves, reshapes and breathes. Brine channels widen and contract. Cavities collapse and reform. The biological films within them grow, die, and rebuild. What appears to the human eye as stillness is, at the microscopic scale, an ongoing act of construction. The builders themselves, the bacteria, algae, and small invertebrates, don't perceive their work. Yet through their cumulative activity, they transform the landscape. They create order where there would otherwise be chaos, stability where there would be fragility. Their influence extends far beyond their size. In a cubic meter of ice, there may be billions of microorganisms, each contributing minutely to the shaping of their shared home. Multiply that across the vast Arctic, and you have a planetary scale architecture built not by conscious design, but by collective adaptation. This living architecture also serves as a defense system. The biofilms that coat the ice act as barriers against harmful UV radiation when sunlight returns. The organic layers absorb and scatter light, protecting sensitive cells beneath. They also buffer against sudden changes in salinity or temperature, creating microclimates that moderate the extremes of the environment. In essence, the architects of ice not only build their world, but shield it, maintaining habitability through structure. The relationship between structure and survival becomes even clearer during periods of melting. As the ice softens, the microbial communities release polymers that slow the process, thickening the boundary between ice and water. These substances, sticky and viscous, increase the ice's resistance to mechanical stress. They delay melting by mere hours or days, but in the Arctic that can mean the difference between stability and collapse for the organisms attached to it. Once again, life acts as its own preservation system. This feedback between life and environment has parallels elsewhere on Earth. Coral reefs, rainforests, even soil ecosystems all show similar self-reinforcing patterns, living structures that regulate their surroundings. But nowhere is the relationship more delicate than here, where the structure itself can vanish in a single warm season. The architects of ice live on borrowed time, constantly rebuilding, never certain how long their creation will last. Yet they continue, because that's what adaptation demands. The fragility of their world does not discourage construction, it inspires it. In recent years, as global temperatures rise and Arctic ice retreats, scientists have begun to notice changes in the architecture. The brine channels are larger, less stable. The algae grow differently, forming thinner films that detach more easily. The once complex networks of life within the ice are becoming simpler. Some species adapt, others disappear. The architecture is changing shape, shifting from the dense, intricate structures of old to more open, transient forms. Yet even in this transformation, the underlying principle remains. Life continues to build, to modify, to participate in the shaping of its world. In the end, what exists beneath the Arctic ice is not merely an ecosystem, but a continuous collaboration between physics and biology. The ice is not a stage upon which life performs, it is a partner in the act of survival. Every pattern in its structure, every irregularity in its form, tells a story of interaction. It is architecture born from necessity, beauty carved from endurance. And deeper still, below the layers of ice and the networks of algae, there are other realms waiting. Hidden oceans sealed away from light, ancient waters that have not touched the air for thousands of years. They too have their inhabitants, their own rules, their own architects. As we move downward, leaving behind the familiar glow of under-ice light, we begin to approach those unseen depths, where isolation and pressure reshape the very meaning of life. Below the floating sheets of Arctic ice lies a depth that almost no light can reach. The further you descend, the more the world dissolves into gradients of blue that darken to black. The water grows heavier, denser and colder, until it settles just above the point of freezing. Down here, time stretches. The movement of current slows to a crawl. Each sound, each vibration, seems to hang in the water before fading into silence. It feels like the end of the world, but in truth, it's another beginning. The entrance to one of the planet's least explored ecosystems. These are the hidden oceans below, places where life survives not on sunlight, but on chemistry, pressure, and patience. When scientists first began probing the Arctic depths, many expected emptiness. What they found instead was complexity. Even kilometers beneath the ice, where the surface world might as well not exist, living communities thrive. The walls of underwater ridges, hydrothermal vents, and deep basins support species so well adapted to cold and darkness that their existence reshaped our understanding of biology. Every discovery from these depths carries the same message. Light is only one form of energy, not the only one life can use. The deep Arctic basins hold pockets of ancient water sealed away beneath layers of ice for thousands of years. In some places, glacial ice forms barriers over buried lakes, trapping water that hasn't mixed with the ocean since before human civilization began. Lake Vostok in Antarctica is the most famous of these, but the Arctic has its own analogues. Subglacial lakes and isolated basins where conditions mirror those of extraterrestrial oceans. The temperature remains stable, the pressure immense, and oxygen nearly absent. Yet in these silent chambers, microbes metabolize slowly but steadily, feeding on minerals and chemical gradients. The energy that drives them comes not from the sun but from the planet itself, the slow release of heat and elements from the Earth's crust. Sampling these waters is a challenge that borders on the impossible. Drilling through kilometers of ice without contamination requires technology and caution at a level few laboratories can sustain. Yet whenever a clean sample has been retrieved, the results have been consistent. Life, even if sparse, finds a way. DNA sequences extracted from these hidden lakes reveal genetic lineages distinct from any known surface organisms. Many of them appear ancient, survivors of evolutionary branches that diverged millions of years ago. To study them is to glimpse evolution running in slow motion, shaped not by light or competition, but by isolation and endurance. The chemical environment down here is hostile by human standards. Oxygen levels are so low that ordinary respiration can't occur. Instead, microbes rely on chemosynthesis, the process of using chemical reactions to produce energy. Hydrogen, sulfur, and iron compounds provide the fuel. Some bacteria oxidize hydrogen sulfide, a substance poisonous to most life, converting it into energy and releasing sulfate. Others use methane, breaking it apart molecule by molecule. These reactions yield only a fraction of the energy photosynthesis does, but it's enough to sustain entire ecosystems. The fact that this process works in total darkness gives scientists a powerful model for how life might exist on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, where sunlight never reaches the subsurface oceans. Moving through the Arctic depths feels like traversing a forgotten labyrinth. The ocean floor is uneven, carved by ancient glaciers and volcanic activity. Soft sediments blanket most areas, while rocky outcrops rise like islands in a sea of mud. On these rocks, sponges, corals, and anemones grow slowly, feeding on organic particles drifting down from above. Some of these sponges are estimated to be hundreds, even thousands, of years old. They filter water so slowly that an individual might process only a few litres per day, but they persist, each one a monument to the patience of cold life. Their skeletons, made of silica and protein, record centuries of chemical change in the ocean, forming archives of stability amid perpetual darkness. Occasionally, small pulses of life descend from the ice-covered surface, flakes of dead plankton, fragments of algae, tiny carcasses. This marine snow falls continuously, an invisible rain that connects the shallow and the deep. Every particle carries traces of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, the building blocks of biology. When it settles on the seabed, bacteria begin to break it down, releasing nutrients that feed other organisms. Worms and crustaceans tunnel through the sediment, stirring it and keeping oxygen moving. Their activity may be slow, but it's constant, and it prevents the deep ocean from turning stagnant. Even here, far removed from sunlight, the cycle of life continues through the steady recycling of matter. Among the most fascinating residents of these depths are the cold seep communities, clusters of organisms that gather around sites where methane or hydrogen sulfide escapes from the sea floor. Tube worms, clams, and mussels dominate these oases. They don't eat in the traditional sense. Instead, they house symbiotic bacteria within their tissues, feeding them raw chemicals drawn from the seep. In return, the bacteria provide nutrients to their hosts. The relationship is intimate and efficient. It allows both to thrive in places where no conventional food exists. Some of these partnerships have lasted millions of years, passed from generation to generation in an unbroken line of mutual dependence. Exploring these communities is like visiting another planet. The colours are muted, ivory tube worms waving gently, pale crabs moving with careful precision. But the sense of strangeness is overwhelming. Nothing here should exist according to the old definitions of habitability, yet it does. The water pressure alone is crushing, equivalent to several hundred times the weight of the atmosphere at sea level. Temperatures hover near freezing. Food arrives sporadically, sometimes not at all, yet every inch of space is occupied by something alive. Even the mud between rocks is full of microscopic life, waiting for the next trickle of chemical energy to flow by. The deeper researchers go, the clearer it becomes that the Arctic's hidden oceans are not isolated from the rest of the planet, but connected in subtle ways. Currents move slowly but deliberately, carrying nutrients and microorganisms across vast distances. A molecule of carbon fixed by algae near the surface may, over years or decades, sink and become part of a deep-sea bacterium's energy source. In this way, surface light and deep darkness remain linked, two ends of the same system. The boundaries we imagine between them are in reality porous. The organisms that live here also play an important role in regulating global chemistry. Methane-oxidizing bacteria, for example, consume much of the methane that seeps from the ocean floor before it can reach the atmosphere. Without them, the planet's greenhouse gas balance would be very different. In that sense, these invisible microbes act as climate stabilizers, absorbing the excesses of Earth's geologic respiration. Their work goes unnoticed, but not unimportant. Even more mysterious are the viruses that inhabit these depths. For every cell in the deep ocean, there are roughly 10 viral particles. They infect microbes, not to destroy them, but to influence their metabolism. By swapping genes between hosts, they accelerate evolution, spreading useful traits across populations. Some scientists believe that in the deep Arctic, where reproduction is slow, viruses act as the primary drivers of adaptation. They're not enemies here, but agents of change, maintaining diversity in a world that otherwise moves at glacial pace. Occasionally, the deep ocean speaks back to the surface. When methane bubbles accumulate under ice and find a path upward, they burst through in sudden plumes, releasing gas that had been trapped for millennia. Some of these plumes ignite naturally when they meet oxygen, creating faint flashes of light beneath the ice. Brief, ghostly displays visible only to instruments. They're reminders that even in stillness, energy is always moving, always seeking balance. The human imagination has long treated the deep sea as a frontier of mystery. Yet, for the creatures that live here, mystery is irrelevant. Their existence is simple, governed by the exchange of energy and matter. A bacterium living a kilometre below the surface doesn't know it's in darkness. It only knows that hydrogen and sulfate are available and that combining them yields energy. A sponge doesn't know that centuries have passed. It simply filters water, one slow heartbeat at a time. The hidden oceans are not exotic to their inhabitants. They are home, perfectly ordinary in their extraordinary conditions. Still, to us, they remain full of unanswered questions. What fuels these ecosystems during times when chemical fluxes cease? How do genetic lineages persist for millennia without mixing? How deep does habitability go? Each answer seems to lead to another mystery. In exploring them, scientists are not just studying life, but redefining its boundaries. The discovery that metabolism can proceed in near-freezing water without sunlight challenges our assumptions about where life might exist elsewhere in the universe. It suggests that oceans hidden beneath the ice crusts of moons like Europa and Enceladus could harbour similar systems, driven by chemistry rather than light. The Arctic becomes a kind of natural experiment, a proxy for worlds we cannot yet reach. The more we learn, the more these hidden Arctic oceans resemble a global nervous system. Slow currents connect basins across continents. Nutrient pathways link shallow seas to abyssal plains. Microbial networks regulate chemical flows much like neurons transmit signals. Each part responds to subtle changes elsewhere, maintaining balance across unimaginable distances. This connectivity means that what happens here matters everywhere. A shift in deep ocean oxygen levels, a change in methane flux, or a disturbance in microbial communities can influence atmospheric chemistry thousands of kilometers away. Despite their importance, these deep systems remain among the least studied regions on Earth. Darkness and pressure make exploration difficult, and the fragility of their ecosystems demands caution. Every probe, every submersible dive, risks altering what it seeks to observe. So researchers proceed slowly, using remote sensors, autonomous vehicles and chemical tracers to study without intrusion. Even so, each discovery expands the map of the possible. Life, it seems, doesn't need much, just a source of energy and the means to use it. Everything else is negotiable. As we ascend again from those depths, The weight of the ocean pressing above begins to ease, and faint light filters downward through the ice. The contrast between the silent dark and the flicker of brightness is stark but connected. The world below sustains the world above, and the builders at the ice's edge depend on the deep currents to return nutrients and balance. The Arctic, viewed from this full perspective, is not a series of separate layers, but a single continuous organism, breathing through its ice, its water, and its depths. What lies beneath may seem distant and alien, but it reflects the same principle that runs through all of nature: connection through exchange, persistence through adaptation. The hidden oceans below are not apart from the living world. They are its foundation, the quiet machinery that keeps everything else alive. And in that machinery, something remarkable happens when temperatures drop even further and movement nearly stops altogether. The rhythms of metabolism slow to imperceptible speeds. Life enters a state that seems more like pause than motion, where existence continues just above nothingness. It is here, in this suspended world beneath the ice, that we begin to understand the slow pulse of time itself. Down here, time doesn't move the way it does on the surface. There are no days to divide, no sunrises to measure, no seasons that arrive with familiar certainty. The rhythm of life beneath the ice is not marked by clocks or calendars, but by chemical reactions, by the slow exchange of energy, by the faint pulse of metabolism that continues even when almost everything else stops. It is the stillest form of existence imaginable, and yet within that stillness there is order, there is continuity. When light vanishes for months, when temperatures drop to nearly unchanging cold, living things enter a different mode of being. It's not death, not sleep, but something between, a deep deceleration. Microbes slow their metabolism until the energy they consume barely sustains them. Their cells operate at a fraction of their normal rate, yet all the vital processes continue. DNA repair, enzyme turnover, minimal respiration. A single chemical reaction that would take seconds in warmer water might take hours here. But the reactions do complete. The machinery of life remains intact, running quietly beneath the ice as if time itself had stretched. For larger organisms, this slowing takes physical form. Fish reduce their swimming activity to almost nothing, hovering in the cold like suspended thoughts. Crustaceans move in brief bursts, conserving every molecule of energy. Even their hearts beat slower, each contraction deliberate and spaced far apart. Some animals, like certain species of copepods, sink into deeper water layers and enter a state known as diapause, a kind of suspended animation that can last months, sometimes more than a year. During this time, their metabolic rate drops by up to 90%. They live, but in a way that almost seems like waiting. Scientists studying these adaptations often describe the Arctic as a natural laboratory for time dilation. Here, biological time runs on a different scale. Generations unfold slowly. Evolution moves at a glacial pace. The continuity of species depends less on rapid change and more on the perfection of long-term stability. A single mutation might take centuries to spread through a population, yet that slow pace also means fewer mistakes. The ecosystem trades speed for precision, noise for clarity. Every process is tuned to the rhythm of cold. This kind of existence depends on balance. In temperate or tropical waters, the abundance of energy pushes life to grow fast, reproduce quickly, and burn through resources. Beneath the ice, the opposite is true. Energy is precious. Any waste could mean extinction. So every organism is built for efficiency, for endurance rather than speed. Cells repair themselves rather than replace. Proteins last longer before they are broken down. Even waste products are reused in chemical cycles that operate with near total recycling. Nothing is lost unless it must be lost. In a way, the entire Arctic ecosystem operates like a long, slow breath. In the brief window of summer when sunlight returns, the system inhales. Energy floods in through photosynthesis plankton bloom, and life surges in activity. When the light fades and the cold deepens, the system exhales. Growth stops, activity declines. The energy stored during the bright months sustains everything through the long dark. It's not a metaphorical breathing, it's measurable in oxygen consumption, in the release of carbon dioxide, in the chemical exchange between organisms and their surroundings. The Arctic breathes with the rhythm of its seasons, its pulse measured in years rather than days. For those who study it, this slow pulse offers a glimpse of how life can persist under the most restrictive conditions. Deep under the ice, where temperatures remain constant near freezing, time seems to stretch, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens so slowly. Reproduction cycles are elongated, growth rates are minimal, and interactions between species unfold over months instead of hours. In the modern world, where life and change seem inseparable from speed, it's a reminder that existence doesn't require haste, it requires persistence. The chemical reactions that define life, the breaking and forming of bonds, the transfer of electrons, the flow of ions across membranes, all depend on temperature. As the environment cools, those reactions slow exponentially, yet the organisms beneath the ice compensate through subtle biochemical adjustments. Their enzymes are designed to remain flexible even at low temperatures. Their membranes maintain fluidity. The result is a kind of equilibrium between the freezing environment and the living system within it. Life matches pace with its surroundings until the two move together. It's a fragile balance, but it works. Measurements taken in Arctic sediments show that even in near-zero temperatures, microbes remain metabolically active. They process carbon, recycle nutrients, and participate in global biogeochemical cycles. They just do it slowly. In one study, bacteria retrieved from a subglacial lake were estimated to divide once every few years. Yet they had persisted for tens of thousands of years in isolation, maintaining genetic integrity across geological timescales. The speed of life, it turns out, is relative. For the animals that depend on these microbial foundations, patience becomes the central rule. Arctic cod, the small fish that form a crucial link in the food chain, spend much of their time hovering near the underside of the ice, moving only when necessary. Their metabolism is so slow that they can survive on minimal food intake for extended periods. The energy they save in stillness is greater than any they could gain by constant foraging. Predators, too, adopt this logic. Seals rest for long intervals between dives, reducing movement to conserve heat and oxygen. Their entire physiology seems synchronized with the environment: slow heart rate, measured breathing, minimal waste. The cold dictates tempo, and they obey. Even the ice itself mirrors this pulse. It grows and retreats in cycles that seem predictable, yet within those movements lie countless small fluctuations. Brine channels expand and contract, salt content shifts, microbial communities wax and wane. Each tiny change ripples outward, influencing oxygen flow, nutrient distribution, and the balance of gases in the water. The physical and biological worlds are locked together in feedback loops, one heartbeat responding to another. For humans, this scale of time is hard to grasp. We're accustomed to motion, to growth we can see, to change we can measure. But in the deep Arctic, progress is almost invisible. A coral colony may take centuries to expand by a few centimeters. A sponge might live 1,000 years, its daily life indistinguishable from its past. In this environment, survival means existing close to the edge of stasis, where every action is deliberate and every change is slow enough to avoid collapse. The Arctic teaches its inhabitants that longevity depends on restraint. That restraint extends even to reproduction. Many polar species synchronize their life cycles with the seasonal availability of food, producing offspring during the short window when conditions allow growth. For some, this timing is so precise that even slight shifts in temperature or ice thickness can disrupt generations. Yet over time, those that endure refine their synchronization until it becomes almost mathematical. It's a demonstration of life's ability to integrate environmental rhythm into its very design. The slowness of life beneath the ice also alters how information passes through the ecosystem. In warmer waters, changes in population or nutrient levels can propagate quickly. Here, feedback takes years to manifest. If a population of plankton decreases one season, the effects on higher predators might not appear until much later. This delay gives the system a kind of resilience. It absorbs shocks gradually rather than catastrophically. The cost is responsiveness, but the benefit is stability. It's a trade-off the Arctic has made for millennia. Some scientists refer to these frozen habitats as time capsules of metabolism. The phrase fits. Within the ice and sediment, cells remain viable for extraordinary durations, preserving the biochemical processes of earlier eras. When the ice melts and releases these ancient microbes, they re-enter circulation, influencing modern ecosystems. In this way, the Arctic acts as both a reservoir of the past and a participant in the present. It's not frozen in history. It's history in slow motion, always unfolding but never rushing. There's also an intriguing relationship between cold and longevity. Across species, lower temperatures often correlate with longer lifespans. The metabolic theory of aging suggests that organisms that burn energy slowly accumulate damage more gradually. In the Arctic, that principle reaches its extreme. The oldest known bowhead whales living in these waters can exceed 2 centuries in age. Deep-sea sponges surpass even that. Their lives unfold across human epochs, their memories stored not in consciousness, but in the layers of their bodies. Each ring of growth, each trace element embedded in their tissue, records another year of survival. The deep cold also preserves memory in the literal sense. Organic molecules, once produced, degrade slowly. DNA fragments remain intact far longer than they would in warmer climates. The sediments beneath the Arctic ice hold genetic traces spanning tens of thousands of years, a biological archive waiting to be read. Through these layers, scientists can reconstruct how life has responded to past climate shifts, how ecosystems have expanded, contracted, and adapted. The slow pulse of time beneath the ice is not just a metaphor, it's a measurable archive of continuity. What makes this endurance remarkable is how little energy it requires. Many deep living microbes subsist on the faintest sources of energy imaginable. Trace amounts of hydrogen, the slow oxidation of iron or sulfur, the breakdown of organic matter deposited centuries ago. The power output of an individual cell might be a billionth of what a single human cell consumes, yet multiplied across vast areas, it's enough to keep the system alive. Life at this scale doesn't thrive in abundance, it thrives in sufficiency. Even at its slowest, the Arctic remains dynamic in its own way. Small earthquakes under the seabed stir sediments, releasing trapped gases. Shifts in ice cover alter circulation patterns, sending pulses of nutrient-rich water through the system. These events are infrequent, but their influence lasts for years, rippling through the slow-moving chain of life. What looks static from the outside is in fact a finely balanced pattern of long-term fluctuations, change stretched so thin across time that it becomes nearly invisible. For those who study these depths, the experience is humbling. Deploying instruments into black water that sits at the threshold between solid and liquid feels like touching a different form of existence. The data that return, tiny variations in temperature, minuscule changes in oxygen, might seem insignificant, but each point is part of a vast, intricate rhythm. To interpret them is to learn to think slower, to align human attention with the pace of the environment. Many researchers describe the Arctic as teaching them patience, as if the ecosystem itself demands a shift in perception. Perhaps that's why studying these frozen worlds often feels philosophical as much as scientific. The Arctic shows that life doesn't need constant motion or abundance to persist. It can exist quietly, almost imperceptibly, and still maintain global significance. The oxygen cycles, the carbon storage, the regulation of heat, all depend on these slow processes beneath the ice. In the same way that a heart can sustain a body with a few steady beats, the Arctic sustains the planet with its long, measured pulse. It's easy to overlook this connection because the Arctic hides its activity behind silence and distance. But the truth is that every breath of oxygen we take, every shift in global weather, carries the signature of that slow rhythm. The world above moves fast because the world below moves slowly. The deep cold provides stability, anchoring the planet's biological system so that motion elsewhere can continue without chaos. If time has a different texture here, perhaps it's because the cold forces everything to remember. Molecules move less, energy disperses slower, and nothing is easily forgotten. Each particle of carbon, each microbe in the sediment, carries the imprint of what came before. The Arctic doesn't erase history, it accumulates it, layering the past into the present until they become inseparable. And as we begin to surface from this still, quiet world, carrying with us the understanding of its unhurried pulse, the perspective changes. The frozen depths are no longer lifeless, they're measured. The rhythm of their existence is not our own, but it's steady, dependable, necessary. Yet even within that stability, larger creatures continue to move. Massive beings that defy the cold, carrying within them warmth and motion, bridging the frozen silence with their own slow grace. They are reminders that life takes many forms of endurance, and some of them, against all odds, are giants. In the stillness beneath the Arctic ice, where everything moves at the pace of slow breathing and careful endurance, some creatures carry within them their own heat, their own rhythm, their own defiance of the cold. These are the giants. They drift through the darkness like living vessels of stored energy, shaped by generations of adaptation to the most unforgiving place on Earth. They are seals, whales, walruses, polar cod in immense schools, even the polar bears that patrol the upper world of ice above them, a chain of endurance that connects the microscopic to the immense. To understand them is to see how power and stillness coexist, how survival can be both delicate and immense at the same time. The first sign of their presence is often a sound. A distant low vibration moves through the water, not a single note but a layered hum that seems to come from everywhere at once. It's the call of a bowhead whale, one of the longest living mammals on Earth. These whales can exceed 200 years of age, their lifespans stretching across eras of human history. They move slowly, their bodies thick with blubber that insulates against the freezing water and stores energy for months of migration. Each breath they take is a measured act. They surface through narrow leads in the ice, exhaling a mist that freezes almost instantly before sinking back below. Down there, in the dark, they feed on the plankton that bloom when the ice retreats. The rhythm of their lives is matched perfectly to the pulse of the Arctic itself. Bowhead whales have adapted to cold in ways that border on impossible. Their blood carries a higher concentration of myoglobin than that of most mammals, allowing them to store vast reserves of oxygen in their muscles. This enables dives lasting nearly an hour, down into blackness where sound and pressure replace light. Their bones are massive and flexible, able to withstand the stress of swimming beneath ice that shifts and groans above them. Even their hearing is tuned to low frequencies that travel long distances in cold water, letting them communicate across hundreds of kilometers. To us, their songs are slow and haunting. To them, they are signals in a vast frozen language that spans generations. Nearby, other giants move with quieter purpose. The Greenland shark, ancient and slow, glides through the depths at barely a human walking speed. Its metabolism is so sluggish that it may live for 4 or 5 centuries, possibly the longest lifespan of any vertebrate known. These sharks inhabit the coldest waters of the Arctic and North Atlantic, where food is scarce and competition minimal. They feed opportunistically, scavenging carcasses or capturing weakened prey. Their bodies contain natural antifreeze compounds that prevent freezing, and their tissues accumulate urea and trimethylamine oxide, chemicals that maintain osmotic balance in the salt water. Everything about them speaks of patience. They don't chase, they wait. Studying them is difficult because of their isolation. Scientists have tagged only a few, tracking their movement through the deep, frigid channels. Some individuals remain at depths of 500 meters for months before rising briefly to shallower layers. They move through a world of near-constant darkness, following gradients of scent and temperature. Their reproduction is equally slow. Females may not mature until they're well over a century old. This pace of life, unimaginable for most species, fits perfectly into the Arctic's timeline. Nothing rushes here, not even the great predators. Seals form another link in this chain of giants. Ringed seals, bearded seals, and harp seals all spend their lives navigating the ice. They give birth on its surface, feed beneath it, and rely on its structure for survival. Their bodies are streamlined for diving, with lungs that can collapse safely under pressure and re-expand without damage. They store oxygen in their blood and muscles, using it sparingly while submerged. Their thick layers of fat act not just as insulation, but as energy reserves, a living storehouse against long periods when food is scarce. When they rest on the ice, their breathing slows to a rhythm that matches the ocean below. Beneath the surface, seals become ghosts. They move through narrow tunnels guided by memory and the faint scent of air. Their whiskers, called vibrissae, are hypersensitive, detecting the slightest changes in water flow, an ability that lets them locate prey in total darkness. When they swim close to the ice, they can sense the texture of its surface through the vibrations reflected from their own movements. This feedback allows them to find breathing holes even when visibility is zero. It's an instinct refined by necessity. A single, missed breath in this environment could mean the end. Their presence shapes the ecosystem in direct, measurable ways. Every time a seal surfaces through an opening in the ice, it allows an exchange of gases between the ocean and the atmosphere. Those small breaths collectively regulate local oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, influencing nearby microbial activity. Their discarded hair, skin cells, and waste become nutrients for the smallest organisms. Even in their most ordinary actions, they contribute to the balance of the frozen world. The connection between the giants and the invisible is constant. Walruses, heavier and louder than seals, are another form of endurance. They gather in great herds on ice floes, resting between feeding dives. Their tusks, elongated teeth, serve as tools for hauling their massive bodies onto ice and for breaking through thin layers when air is needed. They feed primarily on clams and snails buried in the sediment, using their sensitive whiskers to detect movement under the seafloor. A single walrus can consume thousands of mollusks in one session, disturbing the sediment and releasing nutrients trapped within it. This activity fertilizes the water, stimulating plankton growth and connecting the deep benthic ecosystem to the surface layers. The relationship between walruses and their environment is cyclical. When ice retreats, they follow it northward, staying close to the boundary where solid and liquid meet. That edge is rich with life, algae growing under the ice, fish feeding on plankton, predators feeding on fish. The walrus's world is literally the margin, the line between stability and change. It depends on the ice, but also on the melting of it, on the continual renewal that keeps the Arctic alive. Further up the food chain, polar bears occupy a position unlike any other. They are born on land but live at sea, travelling across the ice in search of seals. Their bodies are built for cold. A dense layer of underfur traps air for insulation, and the hollow guard hairs reflect light, giving the impression of whiteness while minimising heat loss. Beneath that, their skin is black, absorbing what little solar radiation filters through. They can swim for hours in near-freezing water without harm, using stored fat to fuel their movements. Yet despite their strength, Their existence is as precarious as the ice they depend on. Each hunt, each journey, is a calculation of risk and energy. When a polar bear catches a seal, the effect ripples through the ecosystem. Scavengers feed on the remains, nutrients enter the water, microbes break down what's left. The cold slows decomposition, allowing the cycle to unfold gradually, spreading sustenance over weeks. Even death becomes part of the rhythm, another note in the Arctic's slow pulse. The bear's survival mirrors the state of the ice. When the ice extends, the bears range widely. When it retreats, they fast, relying on stored fat. Their population numbers rise and fall with the stability of their platform. The giant, for all its power, is a servant to the structure beneath its paws. Among all these creatures, the Arctic cod may seem insignificant by comparison, but it is the linchpin connecting the microbial world to the giants above. These small fish form immense schools under the ice, feeding on plankton and algae that thrive in the thin layers of light. Their bodies are rich in fat, providing concentrated energy for seals, whales, and birds. In many ways, the Arctic cod are the pulse of this frozen ocean. Their abundance determines the health of everything larger. Each winter they follow the shifting ice, staying within the narrow zone where temperature and light are just right. They are the moving bridge between the tiny and the vast. The interactions between these creatures form a network so balanced that it can absorb immense stress without collapsing. The giants feed sparingly, the prey reproduce slowly, and the nutrient cycles turn at a measured pace. Everything operates near equilibrium. But in recent decades, that balance has begun to change. As ice thins and melts earlier, migration routes shift. Bowhead whales travel farther, chasing plankton blooms that occur sooner. Seals move into new regions, crossing into territories once dominated by other species. Polar bears find fewer stable hunting grounds. The architecture of relationships stretches, and with it the old rhythm wavers. Still, adaptation continues. Bowheads alter their feeding patterns, spending longer in open water. Seals find new breathing holes in thinner ice. Walruses gather in larger groups on land when ice flows disappear, changing social behaviours that have persisted for millennia. These adjustments are subtle, but significant. They demonstrate that even the giants, seemingly immutable, can bend when the environment demands it. The question is not whether they can change, but how long they can keep pace with change that accelerates faster than their own slow biology allows. The endurance of these giants also carries lessons about energy. Each of them embodies a strategy for managing scarcity. The whale stores energy as blubber, the seal as muscle oxygen, the shark as chemical stability. None waste motion, none act without purpose. Even their reproduction is measured. Most polar marine mammals give birth to a single offspring at a time, investing years of care in its survival. It's a strategy built on certainty rather than abundance, a recognition that in this place, the margin for error is small. Their adaptations are so complete that they seem inevitable, but they are the product of countless generations shaped by constraint. The Greenland shark's slow metabolism, the whale's insulating fat, the bear's reflective fur, each trait is a solution to the same problem: how to move through cold without losing energy, how to exist where almost nothing else can. Together they form a living testament to the idea that power in nature doesn't always come from speed or aggression, but from alignment with environment. When researchers tag a bowhead or a shark and track its migration, they are tracing the ancient roots of survival. These roots weave through temperature gradients, under ice shelves, along deep currents. The animals know them without maps, guided by senses we barely understand. Magnetic fields, pressure changes, low-frequency sound. All of these may play a part. The Arctic giants navigate a world that shifts constantly, yet repeats enough patterns to remain navigable. They read the water like a living text, written in currents and echoes. What connects these giants most profoundly is not size but slowness. Their movements, their growth, their reproduction all unfold at a pace dictated by the environment. A bowhead's heartbeat can slow to a few beats per minute during deep dives. A shark may not reproduce for centuries. A whale calf nurses for more than a year, gaining mass measured in tons from the energy stored in its mother's body. The scale of their lives dwarfs human experience. Where we measure life in decades, they measure it in epochs. Watching them, or rather studying their patterns from afar, feels like observing the mechanics of time itself. Each migration, each feeding, each long winter, fast contributes to the rhythm of the Arctic system. The giants are not intruders here. They are instruments in the larger composition. Without them, nutrients would not cycle upward through the food web, carbon would not sink as efficiently, and the cold sea would lose one of its main conduits of energy. They are part of the equilibrium, living bridges between light and dark, surface and depth. And as they pass through the still waters, leaving behind only ripples that vanish in seconds, they carry with them the continuity of this place, proof that life can grow large and powerful, even in a world that barely moves. They remind us that size doesn't contradict stillness, that warmth and motion can exist inside ice without disturbing it. Their survival binds the Arctic together, linking its smallest microbes to its drifting ice sheets, its ancient sediments to its open sky. The giants are the visible expression of all that happens invisibly beneath them. They are the breath of the frozen ocean made flesh, the slow pulse of the planet translated into motion. And beyond them, beyond the boundary of individual life, lies a larger system that includes even the ice itself, the cycles of air, water, and carbon that reach far beyond this frozen sea, touching every part of the Earth. What happens here does not stay here. The breath of the Arctic becomes the breath of the planet. Every breath drawn anywhere on Earth carries the faint trace of the Arctic. The connection isn't obvious, but it's constant. The frozen seas and the living systems beneath them quietly regulate the gases that fill the atmosphere. They help control the balance of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and methane, shaping the air that sustains every creature above. The Arctic doesn't advertise its importance. It acts like a lung hidden within the planet's body, exhaling stability while absorbing the excess of change. The rhythm of that breath moves slowly, matching the pulse of ice and water, but it reaches everywhere. The ocean beneath the ice takes in carbon through the simplest of actions. Algae capturing it during photosynthesis, plankton consuming algae, fish consuming plankton. With every exchange, carbon moves downward, locked into organic matter that eventually sinks into the depths. Some of it returns to circulation when predators feed or bacteria decompose remains, but a small fraction falls into sediments, trapped for centuries or longer. That slow burial is one of the planet's greatest stabilizers. It removes carbon from the short-term cycle, keeping the air breathable and the climate relatively stable. The Arctic, with its vast cold waters and slow biological turnover, is one of the most effective carbon sinks on Earth. The process begins near the ice itself. Microscopic algae bloom when sunlight returns, turning the underside of the ice into a thin layer of green. They absorb carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, converting it into sugars and oxygen. As these algae die or are eaten, their remains drift downward in a continuous fall of organic material. The descent is slow, a few meters per day, but relentless. Over the course of the Arctic summer, this steady rain carries enormous amounts of carbon into the deep ocean. Some of it is consumed again along the way, fueling microbes that release carbon dioxide back into the water. But because the surface remains cold and covered in ice, that gas doesn't escape easily to the atmosphere. The ocean holds it, storing the planet's excess breath. Scientists measure this exchange with sensors that track dissolved gases and particulate matter. Their findings show that the Arctic absorbs far more carbon than it emits, at least for now. Yet the balance is delicate. As ice retreats and open water increases, sunlight penetrates deeper, enhancing algae blooms but also warming the ocean. Warmer water holds less carbon dioxide, and microbial activity speeds up, releasing stored gas back into the air. The same processes that once stabilized the planet can, if tipped too far, accelerate change. The Arctic breathes slowly, but its lungs are sensitive. The connection between ice and air runs through every level of this system. When new sea ice forms, it traps bubbles of gas from the water below. These bubbles become time capsules, storing samples of the atmosphere at the moment of freezing. Over years, as ice compacts and moves, the bubbles shift, merge, and release their contents back into the air. The result is a continuous exchange, a slow conversation between ocean and atmosphere that has been ongoing since long before humans arrived. When researchers drill cores through ancient ice sheets, they're reading that conversation backward through time, tracing how the planet's breath has changed over millennia. The gases stored in Arctic ice tell a story of balance and disruption. Layers formed during ice ages show low concentrations of carbon dioxide, while layers from warmer periods reveal higher levels. Each fluctuation corresponds with shifts in ocean circulation and biological activity. During colder eras, sea ice expanded, sealing off large portions of the ocean and trapping more carbon beneath. When the ice retreated, that carbon was released, feeding feedback loops that warmed the planet further. The Arctic doesn't just respond to climate, it drives it. Its breath sets the rhythm for the entire atmospheric system. At the base of this exchange are the smallest participants, microbes living in sediments and within the ice. Some consume methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide. They oxidize it into forms that remain dissolved in water rather than escaping into the air. Without them, vast quantities of methane produced by decaying organic matter would rise through cracks in the ice and enter the atmosphere, amplifying warming. These microorganisms act like filters, absorbing the byproducts of decomposition before they can spread. Their combined effect shapes global temperatures more than any single species on land. Methane isn't just produced biologically. Beneath the Arctic seafloor, enormous reserves of methane exist in the form of hydrates, icy crystals that trap gas within solid structures. These hydrates remain stable under cold temperatures and high pressure, but if the water warms even slightly, they begin to release their contents. Scientists have detected plumes of methane rising from the seafloor in some regions, small now but potentially significant. The Arctic breathes in both directions, and the line between exhalation and inhalation can shift with temperature. The future of that balance is one of the most important questions in climate science. On a smaller scale, the exchange of gases under ice creates localized ecosystems. Within brine channels, oxygen levels fluctuate as algae photosynthesize during the brief daylight, and microbes consume oxygen in darkness. Carbon dioxide concentrations rise and fall in rhythm with these cycles. These minute variations influence which species thrive, which retreat, and how energy moves through the system. Every breath drawn by a microbe contributes to the chemistry of the ocean, and every molecule of gas exchanged under the ice affects the air above. The Arctic's lungs operate at all scales, from the microscopic to the planetary. It's tempting to think of this system as static, a mechanism that runs automatically, but it's dynamic in ways that defy prediction. The formation and melting of sea ice act as valves, controlling how much gas passes between ocean and atmosphere. When ice forms, it traps gases, limiting exchange. When it melts, the trapped gases escape, sometimes explosively. These bursts can alter local chemistry within hours. On a global scale, the accumulation of such events determines whether the Arctic remains a stabilizer or becomes a source of emissions. The difference lies in temperature changes measured in tenths of a degree. The animals that inhabit these waters also contribute to the cycle. Whales, seals, and fish transport nutrients vertically through the water column as they feed and migrate. When they dive deep and then return to the surface, they bring nutrients from the depths into contact with light and oxygen. When they defecate or die, those nutrients sink again, feeding bacteria that continue the cycle. Even respiration itself matters. The collective breathing of marine life, the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide, shapes local gas concentrations in measurable ways. The Arctic's giants, slow and deliberate in their movements, participate in the planet's exhalation with every dive and surfacing. Above the ice, the air that emerges from the ocean mixes with winds that circle the globe. Weather systems born in the Arctic influence conditions thousands of kilometres away. The position of the jet stream, the patterns of rainfall, even the severity of winters in temperate regions are connected to temperature and pressure changes over the poles. When the Arctic warms, these patterns shift, sometimes causing extremes far from the source. In this way, the breath of the planet carries not just gases, but climate itself, distributing the consequences of polar change across the hemisphere. The ice also reflects sunlight, controlling how much energy the Earth absorbs. When it melts, darker ocean water absorbs more heat, accelerating warming, a process known as the albedo effect. This feedback is part of the planet's respiratory system too, because it influences how heat, carbon, and moisture circulate. The Arctic acts as a kind of thermostat, regulating global temperature through its balance of reflection and absorption. As the thermostat changes, so does the world's climate rhythm. For millions of years, this balance has maintained a rough stability. The Arctic's cold kept carbon locked away, methane frozen, and sunlight reflected. But that equilibrium now faces rapid change. The ice cover that once sealed gases beneath is thinning, and the ocean beneath is absorbing more heat. Microbial processes speed up, releasing more carbon dioxide. The old steady breath of the planet is quickening. Scientists measure this shift in data, but the meaning is simple. The Arctic is exhaling more than it inhales. Yet even in this change, the resilience of the system remains. Life here adjusts continuously. Algae alter their composition to thrive under thinner ice. Bacteria evolve to consume excess methane. Animals migrate, carrying nutrients and gases into new regions. The planet's breath doesn't stop, it adapts. The question is, how much it can absorb before the rhythm breaks. The significance of this process extends beyond Earth. The balance between gas exchange, temperature, and biology observed here is a universal principle. On icy moons and distant planets, similar systems may operate without sunlight, driven by chemistry and pressure rather than weather. By studying how the Arctic manages its breath, we learn not only about our own atmosphere, but about the potential for others elsewhere. The same reactions that sustain microbes under the ice could sustain alien ecosystems in frozen oceans far from the sun. When viewed from orbit, the Arctic appears as a white cap, calm and unchanging. But seen through the lens of chemistry and biology, it's alive with movement. Air and water trade molecules constantly. Each gust of wind that crosses the ice carries traces of that exchange. The Arctic doesn't simply exist at the edge of the planet. It connects everything above to everything below. It is the thin border where atmosphere meets ocean, where breath becomes cycle. On the surface, when a whale exhales, the warm air hits the freezing atmosphere and crystallizes instantly into vapour. For a moment it hangs suspended, glowing faintly before fading back into the air. It's a small image of a larger truth, that every breath, from the smallest microbe to the largest mammal, participates in the same exchange. The Arctic's breath is the planet's breath. The slow release of gas from ice, the absorption of carbon into deep water, the balance of temperature and chemistry. Together they maintain the conditions that make life possible. It's easy to imagine this system as stable, eternal, too large to fail. But in reality it's delicate, dependent on the persistence of ice, the predictability of seasons, the steadiness of cold. The Arctic has always been a slow-moving equilibrium, correcting its own fluctuations through time. Yet, as the pace of change increases, the corrections lag behind. The breath of the planet grows shallower, quicker, less even. The result is not immediate collapse, but imbalance, a rhythm out of sync. And still, in the quiet beneath the ice, the same processes continue. Microbes oxidize methane, algae bloom in spring, whales surface to breathe. The ancient exchange between air and sea carries on, slower or faster depending on temperature, but never completely still. The Arctic, even altered, continues to regulate the world it anchors. If the planet could be said to have a heartbeat, it would echo through these waters. The rise and fall of carbon, the flow of oxygen, the expansion and retreat of ice, all of it forms a rhythm that connects us to this frozen sea, whether we notice it or not. Every gust of wind, every season of rain, every lungful of air we take is linked to this remote, quiet breathing. And as we drift again beneath the surface, following the path of oxygen and carbon as it circulates through cold currents, the thought becomes clear. What we call the Arctic is not just a place, but a process. A living balance that binds atmosphere, ocean and life into a single ongoing respiration. That balance doesn't end here. It extends outward, beyond Earth itself, echoed in distant frozen oceans where similar chemistry may shape other forms of survival. The Arctic's breath is not only the planet's, but perhaps the universe's own rhythm, steady, enduring, and deeply alive. The Arctic, for all its isolation, doesn't exist only for itself. It's a mirror, a kind of living laboratory that reflects how life and chemistry might unfold anywhere that cold and water coexist. When scientists peer through the ice, studying the quiet exchanges of gas and the slow rhythms of microbial metabolism, they're not just learning about this one place. They're looking for patterns that could appear on other worlds. The Arctic is not only part of Earth, it's a clue about life beyond it. Its still waters, its dark depths, and its enduring organisms echo possibilities that extend far beyond this planet. It begins with the basics. Life here proves that sunlight isn't required for persistence. Beneath thick ice where no light penetrates for months, even years, entire ecosystems function through chemistry alone. They use hydrogen, sulfur, methane and ammonia as sources of energy, just as bacteria might on a distant moon where the sun's warmth never reaches. The principle is simple and universal. If there is liquid water and a chemical imbalance that can yield energy, life can exploit it. The Arctic demonstrates this rule every day in silence. It's a living model of what could exist elsewhere in the cosmos. Take Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. Beneath its bright shell of ice lies an ocean larger than all of Earth's combined. It's sealed off from sunlight, warmed only by the tidal flexing caused by Jupiter's gravity. For years, scientists have speculated that hydrothermal vents on Europa's ocean floor could provide energy for microbial life. When they study the Arctic seafloor, especially the cold seep communities and subglacial lakes, they see parallels. The same conditions, cold, darkness, pressure, and chemical gradients, appear in both places. The microbes oxidizing methane beneath Arctic ice are, in principle, identical to the ones that might live on Europa. Every observation here is a rehearsal for a discovery yet to come. The Arctic's subglacial lakes are especially revealing. These pockets of liquid, trapped beneath kilometers of ice and cut off for tens of thousands of years, mimic the isolation expected in extraterrestrial oceans. Despite the lack of sunlight and limited nutrients, they remain inhabited. The microbes found within rely on the slow breakdown of minerals, the faint chemical exchanges between rock and water. When samples from Lake Vostok and similar Arctic sites revealed thriving bacterial communities, it was a quiet revolution in thinking. It meant that ecosystems could persist indefinitely without external input, sustained entirely by internal balance. If life can do that here, there's no reason it can't elsewhere. Saturn's moon, Enceladus, offers another echo. Its icy surface hides plumes of water vapour that erupt through cracks, carrying with them traces of organic molecules and salts. The chemistry detected in those plumes Methane, hydrogen, carbon dioxide matches the energy sources used by Arctic microbes. When a submersible in Earth's polar waters collects a sample near a vent rich in these same compounds, the comparison becomes tangible. The Arctic is not just an analogy for these distant worlds, it's a working example. The same chemical language is spoken in both places. Even Mars, with its dry surface and thin atmosphere, carries remnants of ice below its crust. In its polar regions, frost and subsurface ice form and retreat with the seasons. Though it appears barren, the environment isn't far removed from some Arctic deserts, where temperatures drop below -60 degrees, and liquid water exists only in thin films within salty brine. In these earthly analogues, microbes remain active. They endure dehydration, freeze-thaw cycles, and radiation exposure, reviving when moisture returns. Their survival proves that dormancy is a valid strategy, that life can pause for millennia and resume when conditions improve. Mars could host similar persistence, waiting in its frozen soils for warmth that may never fully arrive. For scientists working in both polar research and astrobiology, the connection between these places is more than theoretical. Instruments designed for interplanetary missions are tested first in Arctic environments. Rovers that may one day cross the ice of Europa are driven across frozen lakes in northern Canada or Greenland. The drills meant to sample subglacial oceans practice here, cutting through Earth's ice to prove their sterility and precision. Each success, each recovery of uncontaminated life from beneath the ice, strengthens the argument that similar missions could find life elsewhere. The Arctic serves as a bridge between our world and the unknown. The philosophy behind this connection is simple but profound. Life is not a phenomenon restricted to warmth or abundance. It's a process that exploits gradients, differences in temperature, energy, or chemistry, wherever they exist. The Arctic shows that even in extremes, those gradients persist. There is always contrast between warm and cold, light and dark, salt and fresh, solid and liquid. Life emerges in those boundaries, feeding on imbalance itself. If such boundaries exist on other planets or moons, the same logic could apply. The cold, rather than being a barrier, might be a form of stability. In these parallels lies a quiet optimism. For centuries, humans imagined life as fragile, requiring the exact balance of warmth and sunlight we know. But the more we learn from Earth's frozen edges, the more flexible life becomes. The Arctic teaches that survival is not about comfort, but about equilibrium, the ability to match metabolism to environment. Microbes that grow in brine pockets, fish that produce antifreeze proteins, and whales that migrate through near-freezing seas all show versions of the same adaptability. They don't resist their world, they conform to it. It's the same principle that astrobiologists hope to find elsewhere. Not defiance, but accommodation. The structure of Arctic ice itself offers a glimpse into how other frozen oceans might work. Within its layers, salt forms microchannels where water remains liquid despite the surrounding solid. These channels allow for the flow of nutrients and the movement of organisms. In effect, they create a habitat within the ice. On Europa or Enceladus, the same physics could apply. Even without a full ocean, the boundary between ice and rock could host liquid films where chemistry happens continuously. If microbes can live within those channels here, it's reasonable to expect similar life there. Pressure too becomes a connecting thread. The depths of Arctic basins exert pressures comparable to those expected under kilometers of extraterrestrial ice. Yet organisms here function normally, their proteins adapted to resist collapse, their membranes stable under compression. Studying how they do this informs not just biology, but engineering. The materials used to build deep-sea probes or space landers borrow from these adaptations, learning resilience from life that already solved the problem billions of years ago. The idea that the Arctic can predict extraterrestrial conditions isn't just speculation, it's supported by measurable data. Chemical signatures in Arctic sediments match those detected in meteorites that originated from other bodies. The ratios of certain isotopes of carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur align closely, suggesting that the chemistry of life is not unique to Earth. It follows the same rules wherever it occurs. The reactions that build organic molecules here, catalyzed by minerals sustained by heat from within, could just as easily happen in another ocean under another sky. The psychological dimension of this realization is subtle. To study the Arctic is to experience distance, isolation, and silence on a scale that mirrors the feeling of looking outward into space. The horizon blends with the sky. The sound of wind replaces the usual noise of life. It gives a small taste of what exploration beyond Earth might feel like, a confrontation with both vastness and fragility. Yet amid that stillness, there's reassurance. If life can thrive here, it can exist anywhere. The conditions that seem extreme are only relative to our comfort. To biology, they're just another niche. That perspective changes how we view our planet. The Arctic becomes not a remote wilderness, but a reminder of continuity between Earth and the cosmos. The same laws that govern chemical bonding, energy flow, and adaptation apply universally. The difference between a microbe beneath our ice and one beneath Europa's is simply a matter of address. In that sense, every discovery here extends the definition of home. The possibility of life beyond Earth often leads to speculation about intelligence or complexity, but what the Arctic suggests is something quieter. The persistence itself is remarkable. A bacterium metabolizing sulfur under the ice may not build civilizations, but it participates in a universal narrative, the ability of matter to organize, to maintain order against entropy. In studying that process, we recognize something fundamental about existence. The Arctic's microbes and hypothetical extraterrestrial life share a logic written into the chemistry of the universe. As exploration technology improves, missions to icy moons and planets become more ambitious. Space agencies plan to send probes capable of drilling through kilometers of ice, sampling subsurface oceans, and searching for organic molecules. The data they collect will be compared to what we already know from places like the Arctic Ocean, Greenland's ice cores, and subglacial lakes. Every piece of information from Earth's poles becomes a reference point for what to expect beyond. The line between planetary science and oceanography grows thinner each year. It's also possible that life beyond Earth won't look familiar at all. It may not use DNA, or it may rely on different solvents, perhaps ammonia instead of water. But even that scenario finds echoes in the Arctic. Within the brine channels of sea ice, water mixes with salts to form exotic solutions that remain liquid far below freezing. These fluids behave differently from pure water, altering how molecules move and interact. The organisms that inhabit them have adapted to these conditions, proving that chemistry need not conform to one narrow definition of habitability. Even alien life that seems chemically strange may follow patterns already visible here. What makes this all remarkable is the realization that the Arctic's harshness, its cold, its pressure, its darkness, isn't exceptional but typical. Most of the universe exists under similar conditions. Warmth and sunlight are the anomalies. If life can thrive where those elements are absent, it's likely that the cosmos is more populated than we once imagined, not less. The Arctic's lesson is that life is not rare but resourceful. As we project these insights outward, the boundary between exploration and reflection blurs. Studying other worlds becomes a form of looking back at ourselves. The same processes that may sustain life elsewhere are the ones that sustain us here. Our atmosphere, our oceans, our own chemistry, all depend on the same balance observed in the Arctic. The steady conversion of energy, the recycling of matter, the persistence of order in an indifferent environment. What happens beneath the Arctic ice is not a curiosity. It's a version of the same principle that allows us to exist. In that sense, the Arctic doesn't just echo other worlds, it speaks in the same language they would. The rhythm of freezing and melting, the slow exchange of gases, the quiet flow of energy. These are not uniquely earthly phenomena. They're universal. They describe how the universe breathes wherever conditions allow. When we look into the Arctic depths, we're not only studying life under ice, but glimpsing the shared logic of existence that spans from this small planet to the farthest corners of space. And as we turn back from that cosmic perspective, as the thought of distant oceans gives way again to the familiar sounds of shifting ice and muffled currents, the understanding remains. The Arctic is both a place and a prototype, proof that life adapts by listening to its environment, that survival depends on rhythm rather than dominance. Somewhere beneath another layer of ice on another world, something may be doing the same, pulsing slowly, breathing chemically, persisting quietly in a world without light. The echoes between worlds are not theoretical anymore. They are measured in shared chemistry, mirrored in adaptation, expressed through endurance. The Arctic's silence, once mistaken for emptiness, turns out to be the voice of the cosmos repeating itself in another form. And within that realization lies a deeper question. If the same logic applies everywhere, then perhaps the story of life beneath our ice is not just ours to tell. The Arctic seems quiet from a distance, like a frozen image that doesn't change. But that quiet is not absence, it's function. Beneath the soundless surface, life and chemistry continue in patterns too slow for quick eyes to notice. The stillness here is not death, not even sleep. It's motion stretched thin. Every molecule, every exchange of heat, every drift of current keeps going, held inside an equilibrium that doesn't waste energy. The stillness breathes. The air above the ice is cold and clear, layered with faint halos of vapour that form when warmer air rises from cracks in the surface. Those plumes carry traces of salt, methane and organic particles from the water below. They rise, freeze and fall again as crystals. The cycle repeats over and over, transferring what the ocean exhaled back into the sea. This is the visible edge of the Arctic's respiration, the slow exhale that maintains balance between the deep and the sky. To anyone watching, it looks static, but the data from sensors tell a different story. Each hour brings micro changes in pressure and gas composition. The stillness is a network of activity too slow and even to feel, but it's there. When scientists place instruments under the ice, the readings show patterns that resemble heartbeat traces. Oxygen levels rise during brief periods of light and fall when darkness dominates. Carbon dioxide accumulates in pockets and then disperses as water currents shift. The fluctuations are minimal, but together they create a rhythm, the biological signature of a living world that never stops breathing. The Arctic doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. It has found a pace that allows endurance instead of exhaustion. For the creatures living within it, that steadiness defines existence. A microbe in the brine channel, a copepod drifting near the ice edge, a whale migrating beneath. All share the same background rhythm. Their metabolic clocks adjust to it. Their energy cycles align with it. Even the ice itself expands and contracts in sympathy, responding to tides and temperature like a diaphragm. Over geological time, that rhythm has remained constant enough to sustain stability while the rest of the planet changed around it. The stillness also acts as protection. When conditions shift abruptly elsewhere, a heat wave, a current reversal, a volcanic eruption, the Arctic absorbs the shock slowly. The layers of water and ice buffer impact, spreading disturbance across decades. That lag gives the planet time to adjust. Without it, change would travel faster, and the global system would be less predictable. The Arctic's inertia is part of the reason Earth's climate doesn't swing wildly every few years. Its slowness is not a flaw, it's a safeguard. In winter, when sunlight disappears entirely, the stillness deepens. Ice thickens by millimeters each day. Sound dampens until movement seems impossible. Yet beneath, the ocean continues to circulate. Salty water sinks, fresh water rises, and nutrients mix. The turnover is subtle but essential, delivering oxygen to deep basins and bringing trace minerals upward. Without that movement, the water would stratify and stagnate. The Arctic's breath would stop. But it never does. The circulation continues even when surface ice seems locked in place. The balance between motion and pause is precise. Just enough flow to sustain life, just enough restraint to conserve energy. The same balance shapes the behaviour of animals. When temperatures drop, activity decreases, not out of weakness, but efficiency. Fish reduce swimming to conserve oxygen. Seals time their dives to minimise exposure. Polar bears slow their metabolism while fasting through late winter. Every action, every adjustment serves the same purpose: to move with the stillness rather than against it. In this place, survival depends on recognising when not to act. The biochemical processes that support this way of life are remarkably consistent. Enzymes and cold-adapted organisms operate with lower energy requirements, enabling reactions at temperatures that would halt most life elsewhere. Cell membranes remain flexible, preventing freezing damage. Even the structure of proteins changes to allow subtle vibrations that sustain metabolism in near-frozen conditions. These adaptations don't fight the cold, they cooperate with it. The stillness becomes a framework rather than an obstacle. What makes the Arctic unique is that this equilibrium extends to every level, from molecule to ecosystem. The slow carbon cycle beneath the ice mirrors the slow heart rate of the creatures within it. The rhythm of ocean mixing parallels the migration of species that depend on it. The entire region functions like a single organism, its organs distributed across kilometres of water and ice. Energy flows through it evenly, never in sudden surges, always returning to balance. The stillness that breathes is not local, it's systemic. When satellites record the Arctic's seasonal changes, the patterns resemble breathing even on a planetary scale. Ice cover expands during winter and contracts in summer, like inhalation and exhalation. The carbon exchange follows the same curve: uptake during bloom seasons, release during freeze. Temperature oscillates in corresponding cycles. The timing aligns so precisely that climate scientists use it as a baseline for global monitoring. The planet's atmospheric composition pulses in step with the Arctic's respiration. When that rhythm shifts, it's the first signal of change for the rest of the world. The stillness isn't permanent. It adapts constantly, adjusting its tempo to new conditions. As ice melts earlier and reforms later, the breathing becomes irregular. The ocean takes in more heat, altering circulation. Some of the old feedback loops weaken while new ones emerge. It's not collapse, not yet, but transition. The stillness remains, though now it must work harder to preserve equilibrium. Even this adaptation is part of the same principle: resilience through gradual response instead of resistance. The Arctic doesn't stop breathing when stressed. It changes the pattern of its breath. For those who spend time here, the effect is disorienting. Human senses aren't tuned to such slow rhythms. Days without sunset blur together, and silence becomes a kind of sound. Researchers working in the field describe moments when the distinction between living and non-living fades. The ice groans softly, whales call from below, snow drifts in continuous motion. Everything moves just enough to remind them that stillness is never absolute. It's filled with microscopic noise, the faint crackle of persistence. That quiet continuity has lessons beyond science. It demonstrates that endurance doesn't require speed or dominance. It requires calibration. The Arctic has survived cycles of warming and cooling before, glaciations and thaws, extinctions and recoveries. It endures because its system wastes nothing. Every element, from gas exchange to animal migration, fits into a feedback that balances loss with renewal. This model applies far beyond the ice. Forests, deserts, even human economies operate best when tuned to similar efficiency. Minimal waste, maximal return, balance over excess. The idea that stillness can sustain rather than hinder runs counter to much of human intuition. We equate movement with progress and silence with emptiness. Yet the Arctic reveals that quiet systems can be the most active, that a steady pace can achieve more stability than constant acceleration. The oxygen in our lungs, the carbon in our soil, the moisture in our atmosphere all depend on cycles that operate too slowly for daily awareness. The Arctic's example is simply a clearer version of what happens everywhere, all the time. In recent years, as global attention focuses on melting ice and rising temperatures, it's easy to see the Arctic only through crisis. But crisis is just one phase in a long sequence. The stillness beneath persists through it, adapting, storing, rebalancing. Even if ice retreats to new limits, the fundamental processes remain. Water will still circulate, microbes will still metabolize, life will continue to adjust its chemistry. The system may change shape, but the logic that drives it doesn't vanish. The stillness that breathes is not dependent on form, it's dependent on interaction. The persistence of that interaction suggests continuity across time far beyond human scales. The sediments beneath the Arctic hold evidence of ancient warm periods, times when the region was forested and ice was rare, yet even then the cycles of gas exchange and ocean mixing continued. The participants were different, the pace varied, but the breathing went on. That continuity links present to past and implies a future. Whatever form the Arctic takes, its essential rhythm will remain part of Earth's function. This continuity also carries a kind of humility. The stillness that breathes operates without intention, without awareness. It doesn't plan or decide, it reacts through physics and chemistry. The stability we depend on comes not from control but from balance emerging naturally. It's a system that self-corrects through countless small adjustments. Molecules moving, currents shifting, species evolving. The Arctic doesn't need to understand to persist. It simply continues. That may be the most important lesson it offers. For those studying life elsewhere in the universe, that lesson is valuable. It implies that endurance doesn't depend on intelligence or complexity. It depends on the ability to align with environment, to find equilibrium with surrounding conditions. If life exists under another world's ice, it likely follows the same rule. Slow, balanced, self-sustaining. The Arctic shows what that looks like in practice, a blueprint for persistence written in the language of chemistry and cold. Viewed this way, the region becomes less a frontier and more a teacher. Its stillness reveals how systems maintain coherence despite stress. Its silence demonstrates that stability can coexist with change. Every breath of wind that crosses its surface, every swirl of water beneath, every pause between movements contributes to the same enduring pattern. The Arctic's quiet is not the absence of sound but the sum of all frequencies balanced together. When researchers leave, flying south over ice floes and open water, they often describe looking down and seeing no movement at all, just white and shadow. Yet they know what lies beneath: the flow of heat, the drift of life, the exchange of gases. They understand that what looks frozen from above is in fact dynamic in the slowest possible way. The view reminds them that stillness is not the opposite of motion, but its refinement. It's motion perfected to efficiency. As night returns in full and darkness covers the ocean again, the Arctic resumes its long, even breathing. Ice thickens quietly, organisms retreat into dormancy, and the water below moves in unbroken circulation. The rhythm is ancient, older than humanity, perhaps older than complex life itself. It continues regardless of observation, indifferent to recognition. In its persistence lies the reassurance that balance, once achieved, can outlast disruption. Somewhere under the ice, a small air bubble forms trapped between layers. Inside it is a mix of gases, oxygen from algae, carbon dioxide from microbes, traces of methane from the sediment below. For months it will remain sealed, a miniature atmosphere within solid ice. When spring comes and the ice melts, the bubble will rise and burst, releasing its contents back to the open air. The exchange will last less than a second, but it will complete a cycle that may have begun years earlier. That single exhale is the stillness breathing, the planet maintaining its pulse through the smallest possible act. Seen this way, the Arctic isn't remote or alien. It's part of every living thing's continuity. The oxygen in our blood, the water in our cells, the balance of gases in the air all pass through the same global circuits that include this place. The stillness that breathes here connects to our own. Each human breath participates in the same global rhythm, a quiet affirmation that even at the edge of the world, life remains intertwined, moving together in silence. And so, as the water settles, as the ice reforms, as another long night begins, the Arctic continues to breathe without pause. The process needs no witness. The balance doesn't depend on awareness. The world inhales, exhales, and endures. The stillness that breathes carries on,